Chapter 1471. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1471. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Dimitri's lip twitched when he heard Lionel say this. But, since the two had been able to complete a seemingly impossible mission just a year ago, who knew what they could accomplish now? Even though they hadn't broken into the sixth dimension, Dimitri highly doubted that they had made no improvement whatsoever. Is this all of them? Lionel asked. Before Lionel sat about 12 plaques. They were, of course, all galaxy-ranked void missions. Though it made sense that void missions would be rare, Lionel was still a bit disappointed. If he and Aina had to clear regular missions to deal with their debt to his aunt, not to mention handle everything else they needed to, it would take at least 10 times the time. As much as Lionel wanted to overestimate himself and go for sector-ranked disciples, something he could probably accomplish if his unranked disciple status was still intact, he wasn't a fool. According to his mother's story, she had become a sector-ranked disciple not that long ago. With his impeccable memory, Lionel could still judge the pressure his mother would give him now, and she was at a level he couldn't even see the peak of yet, let alone climbing to such a height. There was definitely a dividing line between galaxy and sector that Lionel didn't quite understand yet, and it was definitely something deeper than just here, as Lionel was pretty sure his mother was still in the sixth dimension as well. This was all to say that Lionel was stuck with what he had. Well, these are all the zones that are on palace grounds. If you wanted to try Void Star missions off palace grounds, the selection is much larger. The trouble is that there's a huge dividing line between what we call restrained void missions and wild card void missions. As you might expect, it's easier to keep tabs on the difficulty and variables of a Void Star mission here than it would be elsewhere. We don't have an endless amount of resources to just monitor everything, especially since some of these locations are on the void battlefield, making the variables even more volatile. Dimitri emphasized volatile. The rules of the Void Palace couldn't be upheld on the void battlefield, so it was a no-man's land of sorts. In addition, it had to be remembered that you couldn't enter the void battlefield until you had a certain number of merits. Usually, that was about the equivalent of a grade 7 galaxy-ranked disciple. So, this matter had nothing to do with Lionel and Aina to begin with. That said, the void battlefield was one matter, but other off-palace grounds missions were a different matter altogether. The clause that Lionel had used to corner Orinik existed for a reason. It was possible for Void Palace disciples to interact with the outside world on a mission-by-mission basis. Lionel's mother had tried to take advantage of this to see her family many times, but as one might expect, with the power of the Void Palace, how could they have missions to complete in such a weak galaxy? Lionel was, of course, aware of all of these things after reading through the rules. The guidelines one had to follow for off-ground missions were quite stringent, and there were even methods of monitoring your progress and location. But, as Dimitri had said, the variables were also much more wildly varied, especially for Void Star missions. The only grace given was that off-ground missions tended to reward far more. Depending on the situation, anywhere from 2 to 10 times more than on-ground missions of similar perceived difficulty. I can show you those missions, if you'd like. Despite his expression, Dimitri was just happy that Lionel wasn't asking for any death void missions. No, I think this is fine. If we complete all of these, we should make about 60 to 70 million void points and 33 void merits. That's good enough. Well, take them all. Dimitri's lip twitched, but he couldn't say that he hadn't expected this. The number of Void Star missions was low. After all, this place was a gathering of geniuses. There were many who just waited for Void mission to hit 3-star before even caring to go after them. Still, something like claiming 20 Void missions as once was definitely a first. Well, Dimitri didn't dare to even say that. He was sure there were madmen of the past somewhere in the history books. Oh, right. Dimitri, can you check my disciple's status for me? Dimitri rolled his eyes. He knew that Lionel purposely waited until after accepting the missions to ask this just in case. Here. Lionel's hand reacted quickly and snatched the badge out of the air. When he saw what it was, his expression flickered. Level 9 quadrant ranked? You should thank your cousin for that. They originally wanted to give you a level 1 quadrant ranked status. This was a compromise. But, remember, if you fail these missions, the penalty is harsher because you're rising above your level. Lionel frowned for a moment before grinning. But the rewards are also better, right? Promoting from quadrant to galaxy was a bit of a hassle and would require Lionel to do some annoying things. But, that was at least better than rising from level 1 quadrant ranked all the way to level 1 galaxy ranked. Dimitri laughed. That's also right. Which cousin helped me? First Nova. Dimitri replied. Lionel nodded and remembered this. He would have to thank him when he got the chance. I wouldn't be too happy, too quickly. It's partly because of this that the pressure on the Spear faction has been so heavy. They gave you the benefit of the doubt, but you spent a year hiding. At that moment, Dimitri froze. The dense killing intent suddenly coming from Lionel made even his spine freeze. Just now, Lionel had sensed a very familiar aura outside the Senate branch as people began to gather around for a show. The 3 people he wanted didn't just want to cripple, he wanted to kill. Chapter 1472. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1472. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Thank you for your help, Dimitri. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with Lionel's words and his tone even seemed to be somewhat warm. The coldness in his gaze didn't recede even the smallest bit. Dimitri could only nod in silence, watching as Lionel scooped up the missions and walked out, Aina following to his side. Outside the Senate branch, a group was accumulating. Though, most were simply spectators who had gotten lucky enough to get swept up in the festivities. Now that they were here, why would they leave? The moment Triana's people started gathering, those around understood exactly what was going on. It must have been that Lionel and Aina had finally been found. In the Void Palace, being in the know was a matter of life and death. If you casually strolled into a high-level faction war, no one would lament your crippling or your death. Keeping your head on a swivel was a must. And, of course, the person who had reported their appearance also helped spread this news for those that weren't in the know. Said individual, who went by the name Nerit, was feeling quite happy with himself. He was quite a high-level galaxy-ranked disciple, having already reached the middle tiers and become a level 4 galaxy-ranked disciple. He didn't fear newbies who had only been here a year to begin with, even if they were amethyst token disciples. There was a certain order to things. When Nerit saw that Lionel and Aina had entered the Senate branch just as he was leaving, he couldn't believe his luck, so he made the report, collected his rewards, and came back to view the show. This time, Triana had once again sent some big guns. Emily and Elliot, the 2 that had cornered Aina previously, had returned, Elliot still carrying his very same smug smile. The third of them had remained silent during the entirety of the first clash between them, and her name was Jova. Jova remained silent as usual, allowing Emily to take the lead while Elliot's big mouth seemed to be perfectly designed to help things spread even further and faster than they had already been. Hey, what do you think? It can't be that they'll hold themselves up in there for another year, right? Elliot laughed. Everyone knew that the Senate branch was a no-fighting zone. Even they, who had come with a whole entourage prepared to take Lionel and Aina down, didn't dare to cross this line. There are rules against that. Emily replied coldly. The Senate branch isn't a safe haven, it's a place for inquiries. The Senate branch member has a right to kick them out if they feel that these lines are being crossed. Elliot chuckled. How convenient to have a bookworm like you to inform me of such things. Now it seems I can finally fulfill my wish. It's almost a shame that I have to share the view of such a body with everyone else. It's been on my mind for an entire year. Elliot howled as though he really was a dog, his antics receiving him glares from half his audience and laughs from the other half. As for the gender split, it was all too obvious. There were many rules in the Void Palace. Something like sexual assault was as prohibited as killing was. This was why Elliot was quite careful to draw a line with his words, as he had heard that Lionel was quite adept at cornering people with his words. But his implied meaning was no less obvious. If it wasn't for the Void Palace's umbrella, his obscene nature made it quite obvious what he would choose to do. As for angering Lionel and Aina, who cared? In fact, that was precisely what he wanted. He couldn't have them running away again. This time, he would make sure to follow through on his promise. Before, Aina could have gotten out of this ordeal just by signing the contract. But now, her little boyfriend had crippled so many of their faction's people. As a result, both of them would be thoroughly humiliated. At that moment, the doors to the Senate branch opened, a rush of cold wind suddenly rushing into the surroundings. In one instant, the atmosphere had been quite lively, and in the next, it became like a cold winter night. Lionel's steps were quite light and one could almost not notice Aina lagging a half step behind at all. A circle of wind rushed around him, kicking up a low strip of dust in a perfect pattern. It wasn't too fast, not too slow. It only felt controlled and unhurried. His steps couldn't have been lighter or more silent, but it somehow still felt like pounding stones, rolling and skipping down a mountain pass and forcing the earth to tremble. Lionel swept a casual glance through the spectator, his eyes feeling like blades of eyes searing into their skin only to land on a particular individual. Lionel recognized this man quite well, his memory was too good. This was the very same young man that had brushed past them as he and Aina entered the Senate branch. Back then, Lionel had already picked up on the skip of his heart and the rush of breath of Nerit had undergone. However, Lionel wasn't one to skip to assumptions without all the evidence. There were any number of reasons he could have been surprised, and even if it was purely for recognizing him and Aina, this didn't mean that he would definitely report them to Triana. Clearly, though, he had made the wrong choice. It seemed that he hadn't been ruthless enough. Hadn't his actions made it clear that there was only one outcome for those who stood on Triana's side? Maybe an arm wasn't enough. Lionel vanished. Before anyone registered where he had appeared, he was already standing before Nerit, his hand clamped over the latter's jaw and squeezing his mouth open. However, by the time people saw this, a tongue was already rotating in the skies, having been cut out of Nerit's mouth. Since his tongue was only used to talk, he definitely didn't need it anymore. More chapters on the way. Chapter 1473. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1473. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Several pupils constricted, a chilly wind sliding up their backs as Nerit's hull pierced through the atmosphere. Since he didn't learn from his predecessors, he could suffer double their fate. Lionel's spear force spiraled like a drill, shredding Nerit's arms to pieces. And since Lionel didn't need him to go off and report anything, he didn't need his legs anymore either. The shrieks of pain and horror curdled blood, spikes of horror piercing into the hearts of all those that saw this scene. No one doubted the message that Lionel was trying to send. Despite the fact Nerit had kept his life, it was a fate worse than death. He was a mere level 4 galaxy-ranked disciple. Though he had some talent, it wasn't enough for a top-level faction to invest into him. So, who could possibly cure such injuries for him? He might have a chance if he begged his family members for help, but that would just ensure that any ambition he had ever had in his lifetime was finished. And that was only if Lionel's spear force was normal. As for if even millions of void points could heal such injuries from Lionel's current spear force, it was hard to tell. At that moment, a whip suddenly cracked through the air. It was vicious and fast, faster than any movement that the human body could ever make. It was this sort of speed that made the whip such a dangerous weapon even in third-dimensional worlds, let alone here. Emily didn't hold back in the slightest, aiming right for the back of Lionel's head as though she was intent on piercing right through it. She had already decided that if she didn't fight with intent to kill Lionel first and worry about everything else later, then they would most definitely be at a severe disadvantage. The likes of Nerit couldn't compare to the entourage that Triana had sent. To those that didn't understand how God runes worked, divisions between galaxy-ranked disciples, even of the same level, were usually decided by 3 factors. The first was what token they had been given when they entered the palace, what rank of nominal disciple they had started out as, and how long it had taken them to climb up to the ranks of galaxy-ranked disciple. While for a place like the 3-pillar galaxy becoming a nominal disciple was a life sentence they would never crawl out from, for higher-level galaxies, there were only so many golden token and amethyst tokens to hand out. Even astounding talents that would have trampled through other galaxies had no choice but to start at the bottom. Most of these talented disciples started near the top rank of nominal disciples. Unlike with the other disciple ranks, which were divided into 9, nominal disciple ranks were different. There was only one holistic group, and everyone was arranged into a leaderboard. If you wanted to be promoted to quadrant ranked, you had to enter the top 3 of your sector of villages and then pass a mission. Only then could you succeed. Those that entered the rank of galaxy within 30 years were considered to be average. This was the category someone like Nerit fell into. It had taken even decades more than that to climb to level 4 galaxy ranked. Within 20 years and you were considered to be above average and a decent talent. Within 10 years and you could be considered to be in the 90th percentile of Void Palace geniuses. Within 5 years and you were in the 97th percentile. Within a year and you were in the 99th percentile. The Void Palace easily had millions of disciples, so this was still quite a number of individuals. There was a reason why Lionel's village was titled 0012. All 4 digits were easily used for the newbie villages. Still, it was a prestigious right nonetheless. Whether it was Emily or Elliot, both took less than 10 years to reach the galaxy rank, and now they were both level 4 galaxy ranked disciples and tier 4 6-dimensional experts. Their strength was not small in the slightest. That was exactly why it was shocking that Emily's whip didn't even manage to make it close to Lionel's head. The instant it crossed the odd circle of wind rushing around Lionel's feet, a line of golden spear force manifested, splitting the whip in 2 and racing down its body. Emily's eyes widened. This was a silver-grade weapon, how could it be split so easily? But that was the least of her worries. In the blink of an eye, the spear force appeared between her brows and her body froze, death flashing in his pupils. So fast. A roar left Elliot's lips, his body lighting up with radiant blue runes as he smashed a fist forward. Bang! Elliot took 3 heavy steps backward, each one causing the earth to quake, a deep imprint of at least half an inch following this one. He looked at his fist solemnly, a line of blood having broken his skin. It was only as deep as a paper cut, and the blood was pooling very slowly, but for Lionel to break his defenses with his god runes activated was a result he could have never expected. At that moment, Lionel let Nerit slowly fall to the ground, turning back. Something about his gaze made the hair on the bodies of both stand on end, their breathing becoming hollow. Hurry up and stop holding back, Emily. Emily didn't need Elliot to tell her, a flourishing light had already erupted from her green hair fluttering as blinding emerald runes began to appear around her. A domain of vines manifested first as energy particles, then illusory constructs, before taking true form, all before surging toward Lionel. The spectators couldn't believe what they were seeing. A 5th-dimensional student had forced 2 geniuses to activate their god runes after just a casual exchange? Chapter 1474. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1474. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. No one would casually bring out their god runes. In fact, many would bring out their ability indexes long before they chose to do this. A god rune was the core of someone's being, and comprehending it required pouring all of your comprehensions into one. In a way, it was a mirror into your inner being as well as one's strongest trump card. However, any disciple of the Void Palace, especially those that could be considered geniuses even among this gathering of geniuses like Emily and Elliot, were decisive. They realized they were in danger in a single instant. Lionel's palm flipped over. Clang! 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 For the first time in a long while, the chain spear made its appearance. Its sleek black body wrapped in chains vibrated like a flood dragon in its cage. The moment it appeared, its blade trembled. One could almost hear it roaring into the skies, its excitement palpable. All those with spears in the surroundings found their weapons becoming agitated, some even finding it difficult to contain themselves and even cracking in the process. As for those that wielded swords, their weapons seemed to shrink beneath the pressure, hiding deeper into their sheaths and cowering into the corner of the spatial rings they resided in. Emily's vines surged for Lionel, but the moment they crossed the circle of wind, they were diced into pieces. It was as though dozens of blades had run through them in all sorts of directions, their bits and pieces falling to the ground without the slightest hint of life. Elliot shot forward, his speed fast to many, but incomparably slow to Lionel. Lionel's gaze drifted to Elliot's blue god runes. They reminded him a lot of the gorillas he had fought in the Void Tower, quite an apropos comparison for a man like this. Swift. Lionel's spear pierced forward, a spiral of energy wrapping around the tip of its blade. It was an absolutely gorgeous sight, the shimmering gold imprinting itself on the heart of all those that saw it as though it was the masterstroke of art. Elliot didn't even register that Lionel's spear had appeared before him until it was too late, one of his god runes shattering on impact as he was sent flying. He coughed up a mouthful of blood, his rib cage threatening to cave in entirely. Lionel's spear only trembled slightly, his base remaining solid and unmoved. His power was perfectly transferred to Elliot. It was as though it would be blasphemous to his technique for any backlash to harm him. Forceful. Lionel's next step felt oddly heavy, his hair fluttering in the wind. It had gotten a hint longer in the year without maintenance, dancing into the air like shimmering filaments of pale violet. Bang! The air collapsed. This pierce wasn't anywhere near as fast as the first, and yet it was as though the culmination of the world had been forced into the blade. The chain spear vibrated with happiness, its body growing by another foot and its weight doubling. It wasn't much since the spear had only been 50 pounds to begin with, but when matched with Forceful, Emily's face could only drain of all of its blood. A bloody hole tore through Emily's stomach, the god runes around it shattering. Hers weren't designed for defense to begin with, but rather area control. Faced with Lionel's strength, how could she last even a single exchange without Elliot's support? Lionel caught her by her hair before she could fall to her knees, the pain of her roots holding up her body weight paling in comparison to the hold in her gut. She couldn't believe what was happening. Even if her runes weren't meant for defense, a god rune shouldn't be so easily shattered. While it wouldn't be a problem for her to reform them with some meditation, that wasn't the problem. In the middle of battle, doing such a thing would be difficult. It was almost like Lionel was weakening her in real time and humiliating her for extra measure. The wound through her stomach was lethal to most, but with her high vitality and the leaning of her god runes, she would be just fine even for several days. However, it was this kind of horror that truly shook her to her core. It was like Lionel had already seen through her with a single glance, enough to know this and act accordingly. What kind of monster had they provoked, however? When she heard Lionel's next words, she trembled and nearly pissed herself. "You wanted to strip my Aina naked, right? Why don't you give everyone here a show, then?" Lionel didn't plan on letting Emily and Elliot off. He would thoroughly humiliate the both of them. His spear rose into the air. However, before it could descend, a soft but forceful voice sounded. "That's enough." Jova stepped forward. Her expression seemed placid and her eyes were unmoved. Just the same, though, Leon's spear didn't pause in the slightest, its tip catching the collar of Emily's dress and slicing downward. Clang! At that moment, a whip shot forward, forcing Lionel's spear back. "I said, that's enough." Lionel looked up, his cold gaze landing on Jova, who calmly held a whip in her hand. It looked as though it had never been unfurled in the first place. But, in that instant, Lionel's absolute domain surged, blades whirling in the air and shredding Emily's dress and undergarments to pieces, even to the point of leaving faint marks across her fair skin. It was clear that Lionel had enough control to not let these faint marks appear, but he had done so anyway. The only slight saving grace for Emily was that the hole in her gut had led to a flood of blood that obscured some of what was below. But, that didn't leave much to the imagination at all. Emily shrieked, trying to cover her body, but not to mention the fact her limbs felt too weak to do so. Even if she could move freely, there was simply too much to cover. Lionel's chain domain roared to life, wrapping around Emily's wrists and ankles before lifting her into the skies. "Today, I won't be letting any one of you off." The ice cold of Lionel's voice made Jova's placid gaze tremble with fury. But, Lionel had already shot forward. Chapter 1475. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM Chapter 1475 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 2,250 power stones. Next at 3,000, unless the double golden ticket event kicks in before then, in which case. 3750. I think it starts soon but I can't remember. Lionel's spear drew lines across the skies from 3 different directions. Each one was swifter than the last, and yet they each seemed to have their own flair as though Lionel was in a different mood when drawing the stroke of each one. Jova's expression became serious, her rage being doused by a bucket of cold water. She suddenly realized that Lionel hadn't displayed even a fraction of his skill, he only showed as much as he thought he needed to show. Today, he would make a display for the spearmen and swordsmen of the Void Palace to see. He needed nothing but his spear to suppress all directions. Jova's wrist flicked, her whip sweeping across. But, the moment they connected, she was forced one step back, then another, and then another. Those who knew of Jova couldn't help but widen their eyes. Emily and Elliot had both taken about 8 years to climb. However, Jova was on an entirely different level, taking just 6 years, being an entirely 25% faster than them. When this number was translated to strength, though, it wasn't a mere 25% increase, even though that would be an astonishing amount nonetheless. It wouldn't even be an exaggeration to say that she was twice as powerful. And it showed quite clearly. She had yet to activate her god runes, and yet she had only taken 3 steps back to a strike that had left Elliot entirely incapacitated. Jova's aura flared, her green hair fluttering. Her whip roared to life, the mandible of a viper opening wide as it snapped toward Lionel. However, in response, Lionel only took another step forward, his blade piercing forward again. Swift. This again? Jova was infuriated that Lionel was actually taking her so casually. But, just as she finished the thought, her construct crumbled, the snake splitting in 2 beneath Lionel's might and curving around Jova's whip. The spiraling golden spear force appeared before her in the blink of an eye, the flexibility of Lionel's spear force leaving her in shock, but its range shocked her even more. Jova lightly stepped onto the ground, her dress fluttering as she dodged to the side. But, Lionel had already struck forward again. Gentle. Lionel's spear quivered in the air, his movements feeling slow and ethereal. Despite his rage, his spear obediently calmed itself, a beam of golden spear force slicing forward with a momentum that made little sense. It felt fast, but controlled, lethal, but hidden, strong, but gentle. Lionel's interpretation of gentle had evolved to the point that it became a profound technique all to its own. To do something gently didn't mean that one couldn't be fast, lethal and strong, it just meant that one had to be fast, lethal and strong in a tactful manner, bringing one's speed under control, reining in one's lethality, hiding one's force. Jova found that her mind was being overloaded. Every time she felt that she knew exactly how to counter, she would realize that it wasn't adequate. By the time she realized that this technique was too profound for her to counter with her level of skill, it had already appeared before her. Without a choice, Jova roared, her god runes blazing to life and strengthening her body. A wall of vines appeared before her and she used the opportunity to dodge to the side. When she reappeared on the other side, her whip struck outward again and again, an emerald mark shimmering upon her forehead. It only took people a glance to recognize the lineage factor of the Vajra family. In such a state, not only was her body flooded with strength and her healing factor was accelerated to an extreme, but the most powerful ability of the Vajra family lineage factor was control over the life force of plants. Not only could Jova form plant life from thin air so long as the proper force existed, but she could control these powerful plants to do her bidding. And any Vajra family member worth their salt would nurture powerful seedlings to bring with them to battle. As Jova's whip cracked out, her free hand opened a palm sending 6 seedlings into the air. In one moment, they were nothing more than seeds the fraction the size of a fingernail. But, in the next, they exploded in size, becoming pinkish gold lilies as large as 3 meters across each. Their stems and vines looked as though they had been coated in green dragon scales and their petals shimmered with a heavy light that pierced through the fog of the Void Palace. The evergreen dragon-scaled lily. In the human world, Plants had two methods of protecting themselves: toxins and physical defenses. In the dimensional verse, this wasn't much different. But the results were far more exaggerated. The evergreen dragon-scaled lily was known for its tough scales. As a pinnacle sixth-dimension herb, its vines were no weaker than any sixth-dimensional weapon. But its most lethal attribute, the 6 3-meter-tall lilies, rotated in the skies. Suddenly, the roar of a wild beast shook the surroundings, pillars of force bearing down upon Lionel. The expressions of those in the surroundings changed. There was no doubt that this was overkill. Jova had actually used 6 such precious seeds at once. Who knew how long it had taken her to evolve them to this level? Everyone could tell that she had poured all the life force of the lilies into this one attack. What if she killed Lionel? How would she take responsibility? Bang! 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 However, to everyone's shock, a frosty aura suddenly spread through the surroundings, the region freezing to ice and causing Jova's summoned vines to shatter like glass in an instant. Lionel slowly walked out from the region, untouched and donned in a radiant armor. "You're angry? I'll show you what real rage is." Lionel took another step forward. For a long time, Lionel didn't believe that he had a single artistic bone in his body. But there was something he had neglected. When it came to charisma, there were very few people who could match up to him. When it came to words, there were very few people who could galvanize a crowd like he could, very few who could stir hearts like he could, very few who could instill fear like he could. Fury. Lionel's spear force seemed to become a raging flame, and yet Lionel hadn't used his fire affinity at all. His blade pierced forward, painting the world in red. Chapter 1476. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1476. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. None here had ever seen spear force react like that. All blade forces they had ever seen were flat and sharp, but this one seemed to have blazed to life as though it had become a golden flame all on its own. The moment it left Lionel's spear, it was like the entire world had been swallowed up, many spectators feeling their eyes redden, their hearts becoming agitated as though they were the ones experiencing Lionel's fury, as though his fury was their own. Jova found herself flying back like a broken kite, her god runes shattering one after another until her body was swallowed up whole. The spear force was precisely like the embodiment of fury. It was uncontrolled, wild, filled with malice, and uncaring about anything. Lionel lowered his spear, his blade radiating with a harsh red as though it had just been laid on a bed of coals. It continued to tremble and roar, its agitation piercing the veil of the void palace. Lionel walked forward without the slightest bead of sweat on his forehead, unmoved and unhurried. He didn't even turn to check on Jova's situation, he simply stepped toward Elliot, who lay unconscious, his god runes having long since disappeared. However, Elliot wouldn't get to stay unconscious for long, a scream leaving his lips as the butt of Lionel's spear pressed into his crotch. The screech shook the very souls of those who heard it, the men who had been laughing away with Elliot earlier paling. Elliot couldn't have been more awake now, looking down in horror, he watched as Lionel continued to slowly grind his spear. His voice came out in high-pitched whimpers, but he didn't dare to move. Even his slightest trembles made waves of pain shoot through him. He could tell that Lionel hadn't crushed his family jewels just yet, but that didn't make the pain any less horrific. No. No, Elliot couldn't even think straight, too worried about the result. But, if he could, he would remember that much like sexual assault was banned, castration was also a huge no in the Void Palace. There were too many geniuses from powerful families here. If someone went around ending all of their family lines, couldn't they cripple a family entirely? How could something like that be allowed? So, much like killing and rape, castration was its own enormous taboo, and the punishment was just as swift. Death sentence. The Void Palace couldn't allow any room to maneuver. The moment such a problem started, an all-out war would break out. You could cripple someone and humiliate them, but you couldn't cut off their family line. However, the butt of Lionel's spear continued to drive downward slowly. The crunch of flesh and the howls of Elliot became the stuff of nightmares. Lionel's expression didn't change from start to finish, his control impeccable. He didn't drive too fast or too slow. By the time he was halfway through, Elliot was already foaming at the mouth, the pain so great that his blood vessels of his popped as they rolled back, tears of crimson flooding out and pooling onto the ground. Their fear of Lionel seemed to become ingrained. As Elliot convulsed on the ground, no one dared to say a single word. Soon, a dull thump rang in everyone's ears. At that moment, even without checking, they knew that Lionel's spear but had driven down to the solid ground. And yet, he continued for several more minutes before retracting his spear. Lionel broke 3 pieces off a nearby wooden roof, ensuring not to ruin its structural integrity, before staking them into the ground. He shredded the clothing of Jova and Elliot to pieces before hanging them up by their hands to the tops of the poles of wood. Then, just as calmly, he aimed his spear at the ground, beginning to draw an array around them. After several minutes, he stopped and turned toward Aina. In that moment, it was like he had become a completely different person. His divine armor faded, his smile brightening up the surroundings. Ready? Aina smiled and took Lionel's hands, the crowd splitting to allow the two of them to leave. No one dared to say anything for a long while, a full sort of silence pressing down upon all their heads. But, when the first person realized what had happened, a second person followed soon, and then a third. The weak of them looked toward Nerit's state, suddenly not daring to go and report this matter. But, there were others here. Plus, this time, this wasn't a report to Triana, but rather to the Senate itself. Someone had broken one of the ironclad rules. The news took much longer to spread than it should have due to the sheer impact of Lionel's actions. How long had it been since someone had broken those rules? Wait. It hadn't been that long ago, had it? Maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And his name also happened to be Morales. Lionel didn't seem to care about these matters. He knew the rules better than anyone, he didn't need them explained to him. He made it to the location of his target zone along with Aina. The region was just as deserted as the first one had been. But, Lionel had a feeling that there would be another commotion by the time they came out. Lionel handed over the mission plaque and slipped in with Aina, leaving the overseeing disciple speechless. This mission, he was pretty certain that it was meant for 16 people to complete together. Plus. Wasn't it a level 6 galaxy-ranked mission? Why was a level 9 quadrant-ranked disciple taking it on? The youth didn't get much of a chance to think about this because just moments later, a powerful aura shot down from the skies, so overwhelming that the youth almost fell to his knees, his expression warping. He might not be a great disciple as he was taking on such easy missions, but it also wasn't easy to claim such missions either. You needed connections, and to form connections, you needed ability. If these missions could be so casually taken, wouldn't everyone want such an easy way of earning void points? This was all to say that this individual was stronger than even Jova, but right now, he wanted to do nothing more than kneel. Bang! Chapter 1477. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1477. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Seems I was late. The voice was cold and biting, but the overseer didn't dare to say a word. He simply stood in silence, his limbs trembling out of both fear and the sudden drop in temperature. Within the zone, as the couple battled through an army that should have put the on their back foot, Aina couldn't help but turn toward Lionel, her eyebrow raised. Did you think this through? Lionel grinned. Think what through? You know what I'm talking about. Aina, is it really time to talk about making babies now? I'm a bit embarrassed. Aina rolled her eyes. Lionel could experience a lot of emotions, at least in theory, but she didn't think embarrassment was one of them. He was already as shameless as you could get. We should have just run. Why did you insist on entering the zone? Don't you think you're a bit hard-headed? You can't use your tongue to get out of everything, you know. My tongue? It seems it's been so long since you've seen what it can do that you've forgotten my prowess. Lionel's voice boomed like he was a valiant king of the Middle Ages, even his speech patterns changing. Towards such a thing, Aina could only be speechless. How did he manage to make everything so perverted? Was he really so pent up? You know that's not what I meant, be serious. I'm serious too. Seriously. Seriously. Aina suddenly felt like throwing her axe at Lionel's head. If they weren't in the middle of a battlefield, she really would have done it too. You'd better explain right now, or else I won't talk to you anymore. Lionel laughed. All right. The commotion Lionel might have been expecting outside the zone portal wasn't much of a commotion at all. In fact, it was deathly silent to the point that even the beating of hearts and the shallowness of their breathing could be heard. In the center of it all, a young man adorned in white robes stood silently, his eyes closed and his body unmoving. It looked like even if the world itself collapsed, he wouldn't budge even a single inch. A layer of frost slowly coated the surroundings about him, but this didn't seem to be done intentionally. It was like his presence itself was ice cold and thus affected the environment. He didn't have to try to cause such an effect at all. The moment anything stepped into his domain, it would freeze. The overseeing galaxy-ranked disciple stood shivering, his brows and hair having already been covered. However, he didn't dare to move. It was his job to overlook this portal. Though under usual circumstances, he would get some leeway, he didn't dare to take such liberties now, not with this young man here. He recognized that white robes, that emblem with a sword standing tall amidst broken chains on his tall collars. The unfettered Blade Party, the current majority of the Senate. He didn't know why he was here, but it simply didn't matter. Across the Void Palace, news spread like wildfire. The reappearance of Lionel after a year was like a flashbang going off in all their minds. Many made their way to the spot of the crime, only to find two beauties hanging completely naked with a young man in the middle of them. The latter's bloodied crotch was something none could ignore, it stood out like a sore thumb, making a chilling wind nip at their necks. Members of Triana's faction came not long after. Seeing such a scene, they were shocked, then embarrassed, and then infuriated. Lionel crippling their members was already enough to make them rage, but this? This was far too much. Any faction worth its salt would have very tight bonds with one another, and this was, even more, the case for factions built around singular families like Triana's own. Elliot was the only one among the three not part of the Vierer family, and both were women. Lionel actually dared to strip Vierer family women naked for all to see like this? Absolutely infuriated, many rushed forward to cut them down, trying to make the spectators scram. But the Void Palace had too many geniuses, a single faction, especially a mere silver faction, couldn't possibly hope to control the masses. Still, many had to give Triana some face. After all, she controlled the medical centers for the galaxy rank and below. Doctors were at the top of the list of people most didn't dare to offend. However, who would have guessed that when they rushed forward, they would be rebuffed? It wasn't that they hadn't seen the formation Lionel had drawn, it was just that who here believed that something Lionel had drawn casually and on a whim could possibly stop such high-level six-dimensional experts. Every time they charged forward, they would fly back out with the same force. And, every time they struck forward with an attack, they would panic upon realizing there was no barrier at all. If they sent forward a full-powered strike, they would just be killing Elliot, Emily and Jova. Even after several dozen minutes, no one could seem to find a method of deal with it. They could only try to encircle and build a barrier, but Lionel had hung them up too high for this to be done quickly. Sister! A screech cut through the atmosphere, a young woman charging forward. If Lionel had been there, he would have recognized this woman quite well. It was the same woman that had run the medicine shop of Village 0012, Rosamond. She charged through, managing to grab Jova just before Lionel's barrier sent her flying back with twice the speed. Bang! Rosamond crashed heavily into the ground, but she had already taken out several robes to cover her sister's body, her gaze as red as could be. At that moment, a mere 6 hours after entering the zone, the portal warped and Lionel and Aina walked out hand in hand. Lionel blinked, feeling the chilling wind around. It was precisely then that the white robe-wearing young man's eyes snapped open. The sound of unsheathing swords rang through the skies, the crackle of ice dancing along the lines of space. Leonel Morales, having broken one of the taboos of the Void Palace, I sentence you to death. Chapter 1478. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1478. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The atmosphere froze, and those who had managed to come over in time to watch found their chests constricted. However, at that moment, Leonel blinked, his head turning toward Aina. I feel like I just got transported into some low-budget martial arts movie. Is it just me? Aina, whose expression had turned somewhat serious, couldn't help but falter. Her soft lips rolled over themselves as she tried to hold back her laughter. Leonel was a fan of cool uniforms, but this was too much. In fact, it bordered on tacky and even crossed over the line somewhat. Half-closed eyes, arrogant expression, cold aura, and those pure white robes. Leonel almost wanted to gag. Cool uniforms were fine, but how could you go out in public like this? I'm pretty sure this is how everyone from the Unfettered Blade Party dresses, Aina said lightly, trying to stay serious. All of them? Did no one tell them that they look ridiculous? Aina couldn't seem to take it anymore, an adorable snort leaving her nose completely out of her control. She couldn't maintain her serious expression anymore even if she wanted to. In the end, she doubled over in laughter, hitting Leonel's arm. Those that were spectating couldn't help but put on weird expressions before their eyes landed on the white-robed youth. No one had ever really spoken about it before, but these robes really were a bit too tacky. Unlike the official Void Palace robes which had a bit of modern flair to them, the Unfettered Blade Party official uniform hadn't changed in generations. It looked like it was centuries too old. That much would have still been fine if it wasn't for the arrogant and high-nosed attitudes of the young men and women that wore it. It really looked like all of them were trying to become the main characters of their own stories. When no one really thought about it, it was still acceptable. But, after Leonel mentioned it with such flair and genuineness, it felt like the Unfettered Blade Party had suddenly become a bunch of children playing superhero in their parents' living rooms. If I ever design a uniform that bad, please let me know in advance. I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I found out too late. Leonel's fascination with cool uniforms of course meant that he had every intention of designing his own in the future. How could he not make sure that his armies were in good form? All right, that's enough. Aina wheezed, pushing Leonel away. Aina knew well that Leonel had done this on purpose. With how well Leonel understood people, if what he wanted to do was de-escalate the situation, he would have taken a much different approach. Clearly, though, he was provoking this young man and he didn't seem to care that he was slapping the faces of the Unfettered Blade Party at the same time. The young man stood unmoved, but it was clear by the sound of swords in the air that his mood had shifted. From a cold indifference, there was an added forcefulness to his aura. He didn't speak a word, he didn't waste time on pleasantries, he didn't even seem to take a breath or a gather step. In one moment, he was a sheathed sword and in the next, he had unleashed it, a blinding light tearing through the spear and appearing before Leonel in the blink of an eye. It was clear that he had every intention to kill. There was no need to say anything. However, just when the blinding light was about to enter a 5-meter radius of Leonel, something astonishing happened. Clang! Bang! Leonel didn't even bother to take a single step, nor did he flinch in the face of the sword force. He didn't even seem to make an effort. Much like the young man, his hands didn't move and his expressions were unmoved. But, what was shocking was the fact that Leonel's 5th-dimensional spear force countered what was clearly 6th-dimensional sword force without much difficulty at all. Leonel watched indifferently as the spear and sword force wrapped around one another before spiraling out of control and shattering into motes of white and gold light. If the goal is to kill me, they probably should have sent someone stronger. Your blade isn't cold enough and your sword isn't sharp enough. Something about Leonel's words was decidedly sharp. The words echoed through their ears, stirring something deep within them, even without understanding how they subconsciously felt that he was speaking the truth. Whether by coincidence or something else, the youth's sword force seemed to dim and weaken, even the sounds of sharpening blades dulling by a measure and slowing down in frequency. The eyes of the young man seemed to finally see Lionel for the first time. Someone in the fifth dimensional had blocked an attack from him? Was something like this even possible? He couldn't even fathom how such a thing was possible. Even if the strike was casual, even if he didn't draw his blade or activate his god runes, this was ridiculous. I see. The youth said lightly. I guess it makes sense, anyone who could make it here wouldn't just simply allow themselves to be killed. But, that much is fine, killing you and taking revenge for my uncle's arm will be worth it. The arm of a Suyard in exchange for the head of a Morales. This is a worthy start until the day I take the head of Velasco myself. My name is Mike Rath. I leave this name not for you, but so that others will understand in the future that the Suyard name is not one you can casually disregard as you please, no matter who you are. The words were sharp, venomous, and clearly filled with disregard. Lionel, however, who had just been planning on casually playing around for a while and forcing this person into a trap before revealing his true intentions, suddenly paused. The amusement in his eyes faded, his expression not quite becoming cold, but something beyond that instead. It was difficult to explain, but it was the kind of expression one would know when one saw it. The kind of a mortal looking down on an ant, an emperor looking down on a subject, a god looking down on a servant. Take the head of his father? Was he even able to take his own head? Lionel didn't say a word, he only took a step and vanished from sight. When he reappeared again, the clanging of chains sung through the darkness. Chapter 1479. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1479. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. When Lionel finally slowed enough to be tracked by the naked eye, he was wreathed in a radiant blue. However, that only lasted for the smallest instant of time before all anyone could see was a blinding gold. Mycrath's pupils constricted, the tip of Lionel's spear appearing larger and larger in his eyes. He couldn't help but notice that Lionel had crossed his domain without the slightest hindrance, entirely unmoved by his aura of cold. Reacting quickly, Mycarth formed a seal with his left hand, causing a shield of ice to appear before him in less than a fraction of a moment. However, as soon as it appeared, it was pierced through, the residual spear force sending Mycarth flying into the distance. Everywhere his body passed, space sparkled and the fog froze into icicles, even the wind itself seemed to condense, only to be smashed through by his momentum in the next instant. Lionel's feet lightly touched down, his divine armor shimmering. That hand sign Mycarth had made in the final moment was pretty interesting, and Lionel only needed a glance to know what it was. While hiding some ability indexes was worthwhile, there were others that were such a core part of your battle style that it would instead be foolish to do this. Lionel was one such example. Hiding his ability index would be a rather stupid choice. He only did so when he wanted a change of pace, and that had only happened once. Usually, his ability index was always churning in the background, the only difference was how much he was using it. Clearly, the same was true of Mycarth. Unsurprisingly, Mycarth's ability was more auxiliary. Such abilities were the best to make large parts of your battle style rather than hiding. His ability index fell into an energy manipulation type category, and was more precisely known as the Nodal Control Ability Index. At its lowest tier, this ability index allowed one to form larger force nodes than most, and their force node pathways were also large in comparison. At its tier 4, however, one could freely control and shift and change the location of their force nodes as they please without any damage or harm to themselves. This sounded like an unnecessary ability. After all, everyone would always have one node configuration that suited them the very best, and that would be decided at quite an early age. However, there was a path and type of force art technique that Lionel had learned about in the Void Library that made such an ability not only worthwhile but also extremely powerful. To make a long story short, Mycarth could designate a new position for his force nodes with a different hand sign. Lionel couldn't be surprised if he had hundreds, if not thousands of hand signs. The moment he activated this hand sign, his nodes, and their pathways would change position, forming a force art and deploying the technique instantaneously. Not only would the technique be deployed with extreme speed, but because Mycarth's body itself was resonating with it, it was also far more powerful than most techniques as well. Mykarth didn't need to waste time learning and memorizing force arts, nor did he need to waste time on learning precise force control and flow. All he needed to do was pick a technique he liked, go into meditation for a few hours, picks a hand sign for it, tie this hand sign to a new node configuration, and then he would be able to deploy it in battle as he pleased. This ability, if used by someone clever and with the necessary resources, was truly frightening. Mykarth had hardly been ready for Lionel's speed and had still been looking down on the ladder, and yet he actually still managed to react with such a powerful defense. While Lionel was feeling a bit impressed by Mykarth, those who were watching on were actually feeling the exact opposite. Mykarth was a member of the Unfettered Blade Party. He was in existence no more than a decade or two away from becoming a sector-ranked disciple. And yet someone in the fifth dimension had sent him flying with a single spear. This was ridiculous. If the Unfettered Blade Party hadn't been confident in Mykarth, they would have never sent him. This wasn't a scene anyone had expected to see. At that moment, Mykarth crashed against the ground, but he roared in the next instant, his body shooting into the skies. He formed another hand seal, causing several swords of ice to form around him. They wrapped themselves in sword force, shooting forward like blazing meteors as Mykarth fell from the skies. However, Lionel's domain seemed even stronger now that he held a spear in his hands. A winding tornado of spear force manifested, shredding them to pieces. Lionel's took a step forward, the seams of his divine armor radiating with a blinding golden light as three illusory tails stretched out for dozens of meters. Starry light domain. When Lionel took another step, he vanished once more. Mykarth thought that he had already adjusted to Lionel's speed after the first time, but his eyes could only widen when he realized that he had lost track of Lionel once again. Yet another spear appeared between his brows. Yet another ice shield formed. And Mykarth was once again sent flying back like a speeding bullet. Bang! Mykarth had been thoroughly humiliated, his words of grandeur seemed to come off as quite hollow, just like his white robes. Another roar sounded and a frigid pillar of ice soared into the skies. Mykarth's god runes blazed to life, his palm flipping over to reveal his icy blue sword. He had had enough. But, right then, that's enough. Cornelius appeared between the two young men as though he had always been there, causing Mykarth to feel as though his towering aura had fallen like a drop in the ocean. Cornelius' gaze turned toward Lionel, but to his surprise, the latter had already removed his armor. After hearing what had happened, Cornelius knew he had to come. No one knew what happened to Lionel in the Void Tower, but there was potentially the chance that no one other than the Void Elders could hope to deal with Lionel if whatever happened before occurred again. But, what he didn't expect was for Lionel to be so cooperative. Lionel's next words truly left him speechless, though. Elder, I'm just a small-time quadrant-ranked disciple, yet I was attacked by a galaxy-ranked party member who had every intention to kill me. He even said that he would get revenge for my father's actions by taking my head and even threatened to take my father's head in the future. That's a violation of a Tier 3 rule, and 2 taboo rules, not to mention several other violations that would be too long to list. I'll have to ask you to please uphold justice. Cornelius' lip twitched. He had just gotten himself out of Lionel's dream loop. Did this kid want to throw him into another one? Weren't you the one who broke a taboo law first? Cornelius could only blame himself. He must be a glutton for punishment. Chapter 1480. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1480. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Many were astonished. The only thing that seemed to make sense was that Lionel either hadn't realized the gravity of what he had done, or he really thought that he could use his backing to dodge this punishment as well. The rumors about how Lionel had gained the amethyst token had been circulating for a long while, but after he defeated Amory, much of that talk had died down. The only ones who held on to this narrative were those who knew that Amory had been suppressed during that period, but it wasn't as though the Seward family would go around exposing the secrets of their family heirlooms so casually. In addition, Amory had also been uncaring about making excuses, so outside of a core few who knew the truth, this talk had been put to rest long ago. This went to show just what kind of monster Amory was, and what kind of weight his name held. Defeating him was enough to give Lionel the cash he needed to no longer have to deal with such annoying chatter. But, unfortunately, that wasn't where his issues stopped. News of the White Lion Bao was still at the forefront of the Bao faction's mind. It was just that Lionel had made so few appearances in the last year that no one could pin him down. And, obviously, charging into the Spear faction was a huge no-no. Then there was the odd matter with the Void Tower. The Void Elders obviously didn't spread the news of what had actually happened because the matter was so sensitive, and as such left the decision up to the Void Senate's whims. This was, of course, also a method of protecting Lionel. If others knew that it was truly Lionel's own ability that allowed him to climb so high and there was nothing wrong with the Void Tower, the level of commotion it caused would not be small. Let alone the human domain, the spies of other race domains would raise an eyebrow. Though most weren't in the know, how could the Void Elders not be aware that the other races had started paying more and more attention to their human race recently? The closer Earth got to maturity, the closer the dimensional verse seemed to grow toward all-out war. However, it was precisely because of this that more dissatisfaction was caused. The rule was that only by clearing the 10th floor on the first try could you become a galaxy-ranked disciple. If you failed, then you should start at level 1 quadrant ranked just like every other golden token holder. Yet, because of First Nova, Lionel was actually able to become a level 9 quadrant ranked disciple from the very beginning, treatment that no one else got. As though this wasn't bad enough, there was still the matter of staying in the Spear faction for free, and now he had castrated people before demanding justice for himself? Even neutral parties would be dissatisfied watching these matters unfold one after another. The Void Palace was supposed to be the pinnacle of the human domain. There wasn't supposed to be anyone with a strong enough background to make it sway to and fro. And yet, that was exactly what Lionel seemed to be doing on a daily basis. There was little Lionel could do about such impressions. Sometimes, the first impression was the most important one. There was a reason he was so infuriated with Orinik for spreading such information, even if it was technically true. He had ruined Lionel's reputation just so that he could line his pockets. Lionel could only continue to prove people wrong. One might be fooled by Lionel's usual personality, thinking of him to be an individual who lived to please others. However, the reality was that just because Lionel could be charismatic given the situation, didn't mean that he was obsessed with having people like him. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Oftentimes, he couldn't be bothered. That was why he always had such a hard time in the dimensional verse. Once things started off on the wrong foot, he couldn't be bothered to fix them. Back in Royal Blue Academy, when those rich and noble youths of his school looked down on his Paradise Island origins, he didn't mind them either. It was because he spent 4 years with them that things eventually changed. With his other organizations, Lionel didn't spend more than a couple of months here and there. But, with Camelot, didn't things turn around? With the Slayer Legion, wasn't he on good terms with them now? Even with Valiant Heart Mountain, had he not helped them to save the majority of their students? Lionel's life seemed to always be like this. For some reason, at that moment, Lionel's thoughts flashed back to Anya's face. He didn't know why it had suddenly done this. His current thoughts didn't seem to have anything to do with her at all. And yet, the sparks of his dreamscape seemed to be working as hard as they could to no avail. Despite how long these matters had taken to describe, it was still nothing more than a blink of an eye to Lionel. However, when he was caught off guard by Anya's face, his pause became more obvious to the people around him. Seeing that Lionel wasn't explaining himself, Cornelius frowned. Could it really be that he was just saying nonsense and hoping that Cornelius would help him to smooth things over? Cornelius felt a headache coming along. If they really killed Lionel, what if that man went on another rampage? Last time he hadn't even had evidence that they were part of his father's death, yet he had wreaked so much chaos. This time, there would be no doubt that Lionel was, in fact, killed at their hands. What should he do? Cornelius' hesitation seemed to be sensed by the surrounding students, causing their hearts to go cold. Could it be that even breaking a taboo law wasn't enough for the Void Elders to deal with Lionel? Where were the rules? What if one of them was next? At that moment, Lionel shook his head, understanding that he couldn't make the final connections now no matter how hard he tried. Oh, right. Lionel almost forgot that he was meant to start an explanation now. Chapter 1481. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1481. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Right, as I was saying, fighting between disciples is usually not policed and competition is encouraged, but such a thing is also only allowed within certain limitations. If a domain ranked senior came down to thrust their sword at me, how would I even manage to survive? Thus, fights between disciples with large rank divisions between them must be sanctioned or occur during certain exceptions. For example, if I enter a faction's territory, they can deal with me with students and the entire full rank above me without breaking the rules. Or, if I attack a higher ranked disciple first, then it doesn't matter what rank they are. However, in this situation, that did not happen. I'm only in the level 9 quadrant rank, but this Mycrath individual attacked me. Not only did he attack me, but he attacked to kill. This is a violation of a taboo law. The exact law states that killing or killing intent toward a fellow disciple is prohibited. It's usually impossible to prove killing intent, so it's rarely enforced, but he spoke quite clearly that he had intentions to kill me. I'm sure many heard it. But, this was just one of the taboo laws that he broke. Another is that a disciple of the Void Palace is the arbiter of peace for the human domain. They must not lay hands on or have the intent to harm the commoners. I might be ignorant of many things, but I know my father well enough to know that it's an impossibility that his name wouldn't be on at least one leaderboard. And yet, I don't see his name. The only explanation is that his name has been wiped from the record, meaning that he isn't a person of the Void Palace and should be able to receive its protection. And yet, this Mycrath individual said that he would take his head in the future? Is that not intent to harm the commoners? I could list many other violations he's crossed, especially since he's on duty as the representative of a majority leader. Since it doesn't look like you believe me, I can still list at least one. When he came here, he said, "I sentence you to death." Even if I committed the crime of breaking a taboo law, that would still be grounds for punishment. Vigilante justice is not allowed and represents the breaking of another rule. If anyone could dole out punishment, then what would we need the Void Senate for? If that's not enough, I can list another one too. That's enough. Cornelius finally couldn't take it anymore. The moment Lionel started talking about Velasco and even called him a commoner, he almost couldn't stop himself from laughing anymore. There had to be a limit to shamelessness. That rule was in place to protect the weak, not to protect the man whom even the Void Elders were apprehensive of. Aina bit her lips hard, trying to hold back her laughter. Much of the crowd, even those dissatisfied with Lionel, couldn't help but look away, trying to hide the amusement in their eyes. Even Cornelius himself was forced to stop Lionel before he got any closer to losing his composure. The only person who seemed truly infuriated was Mycrath himself. Why was he being treated like some sort of jumping clown? He had been able to remain calm previously because he could already see the sign of Lionel's death. But, after being blown back twice and then forced to stop just before he could unleash his full strength, he felt stifled beyond compare. Now he was forced to just stand here and listen to Lionel's nonsense. It was absolutely infuriating. Lionel, this is a serious matter. Since you're so familiar with the laws, you should also know that what you've done is intolerable. This cannot be allowed. I broke a taboo law? Lionel blinked, feigning confusion. I've read the laws of the Void Palace front to back, but even if I hadn't, there are only a few taboo laws and everyone knows them. I wouldn't be stupid enough to accidentally break one. Cornelius' brow furrowed. This was much less funny. Lionel wasn't taking this matter seriously at all. Setting aside the fact no one would believe a fifth-dimensional existence had read all of their laws front to back, just the fact Lionel dared to say this made Cornelius' favorable impression plummet. Did Lionel think that he would just help him sweep this matter under the rug? Even if Cornelius knew that killing Lionel would cause trouble, he was a man who followed the letter of the law to the end. Even if he had to allow the Void Palace to sacrifice him to sate Velasco's rage, he would do it. But, he wouldn't let Lionel prance atop his head like this. Lionel. Cornelius' voice was much more forceful, the momentum of a seventh-dimensional existence blooming forth in waves. Many couldn't help but take a step back. Lionel frowned, his joking attitude vanishing. "This is so annoying," Lionel said, cutting Cornelius off. "No one bothers to do their research anymore. Someone said I castrated a person, now it's suddenly fact. Did either of you two who came to mete out punishment even go and check? The taboo states that the crime of castration is punishable by death, but I didn't castrate him. I crushed his penis and one of his balls, the other one is just fine. He can have children in the future. I have things to do, go and double-check what the truth is before wasting my time. And I also hope this supposed seared family member is also punished to the standards of the law." Lionel took Anna's hand and walked away, heading right toward his next mission site. Cornelius' lip twitched. He was trying to help Lionel previously. How had he suddenly ended up being scolded? Only crushed one penis and one ball? Was he supposed to go and verify that now? Cornelius' expression changed suddenly, thinking of something. He stepped through the air, vanishing in the blink of an eye. Mykarth was left behind, seething. Chapter 1482. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1482. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Why do you choose that approach? He was trying to help, you know. He didn't deserve that, Aina said disapprovingly. Hearing this, Lionel nodded. You're not wrong, but I wanted to get out of there fast. He needs to get over there quite quickly if he wants to stop what's likely to happen, and this was the fastest way. If I had said it more nicely, we'd still be there exchanging words. Aina raised an eyebrow. Lionel wasn't wrong. But, what required such speed? She shook her head for a moment before she suddenly thought of something. Her gaze sparked with fury. You think it's possible? I didn't really think about it before, but after seeing Mykarth, I wouldn't put it past them. You're not worried? Lionel grinned. Not really. The formation I drew around them isn't all that easy to deal with. They'd be able to take down the two women so long as their strength is great enough. But it'll take more than strength to take down that bastard. Lionel had hung up Elliot in the middle of the two women for a reason. In fact, Elliot's stake was dug into the ground right at the very center of the formation. Lionel was a man who had been able to teleport out dozens of geniuses from the depths of a Rapak's nest. Even though he hadn't picked up a force-crafting quill in over a year now, his skill had still been increasing by leaps and bounds, whether it was his subtle breakthroughs in comprehension, his understanding of calligraphy and poetry, or his stint in the Void Library. The number of research papers Lionel had read on crafting and spatial rings especially was astronomical. There was likely no other disciple beneath the domain rank that understood better how to manipulate space through force arts than he did right now. If they thought pulling the wool over his eyes and taking advantage of him was so easy, they'd be sorely mistaken. As Lionel and Aina entered their second zone together, Lionel's assumptions were coming true in real time. The infuriated members of Triana faction had already managed to bring Jova and Emily down, but no matter how hard they tried to get to Elliot, they found themselves being thrown back. Triana herself seemed to refuse to make an appearance, but many members of her faction were trying to save face by taking him down. However, there were several in the group that had darker than usual faces. At this rate, we're not going to be able to fulfill faction leader's command. This is ridiculous. I don't believe that we can't deal with this. Did the Earth Force specialist come over yet? We need to crack the ground and then we can get to him. We already tried that, but he wasn't strong enough. You know, breaking the ground in this place is tough. The only Earth affinity specialists with any kind of strength in this place before reaching the upper tiers of the 6th dimensional are the Morales. The others all stink. So then we just have to invite one of them over. We have plenty in the faction. You know that the moment we became silver we've been on a race to gold. Faction leader isn't willing to be patient anymore. We spent too long as bronze ranked building up our foundation. It's time to explode in growth. They're all doing missions. Not even one remained. It can't be helped. Battle merits are our greatest weak point ever since faction leader lost most of the void merits she gained from the leaderboards. That's why this is so important. Fuck, I'm going to try again. A young charged forward, his feet stomping hard just outside of the lines Lionel had drawn before launching himself forward. His speed wasn't slow in the slightest, and his strength was great. Many who saw this could only nod to themselves. The galaxy-ranked disciples of Triana's Green Thread faction were not weak at all, it was just that Lionel seemed to make them look like that. Usually by now, the crowd would have long since dispersed, and that it had. Unfortunately for their Silver Grade faction, Lionel had tied them up right in the middle of the main road leading to a Senate branch. There was no escaping it. The young man shot up like a speed bullet, but he immediately realized that he wasn't going to make it. It was at that moment that a sinister light flashed in his eyes. A whip appeared in his palm and it cracked with lightning before he flicked his wrist. To an outsider, it looked like he was trying to cut Elliot down by the stake, but he knew his true motive. Just when the whip was about to reach the stake, a strong spatial fluctuation sent the young man reeling backward. But, how many times had the young man experienced this? He was already prepared. At that exact moment, he lost control of his whip and it just barely changed trajectory, aiming for Elliot's crotch. The region was nothing but a bloodied mess. By now, the crimson had faded and hardened, becoming lumps of black and dangling flesh no one could make out from the other. It was only the Green Thread faction members that had noticed that Elliot actually had one testicle left. When this was relayed to Triana, she gave a very simple command. Crush it. Her goal was clear. She wouldn't give Lionel any room to maneuver and wanted to force him into a dead end. What would happen if Lionel's claims were investigated, only for everyone to learn that he had actually lied, and Elliot really was castrated? The strike of the young man was vicious and his acting was perfect. On top of that, everyone already believed that Elliot had been castrated, so who would think of foul play? There wasn't a single person in the Void Palace that wasn't a genius among geniuses. Even this seemingly random young man had so skillfully timed and controlled his whip like this, already calculating that his strike would be perfect. Chapter 1483. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1483. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Just as the whip was about to connect, a wild distortion formed. Before the young man could react, the tip of his whip, which had just been moments away from crushing what was left of Elliot's manhood, suddenly appeared before his face. Bang! The young man's face distorted, his jaw shattered and his tongue nearly being cut in two. He skid along the ground, his body shooting off into the distance. Before he even landed, the humiliation had welled up in his heart. He had actually been slapped by his own weapon. In the history of the Void Palace, this was maybe the first time such a thing had happened. He crashed into the ground, holding his jaw as his body was shaken by pain. If it wasn't for his relative immunity to lightning, the effects would have been even more drastic than it was here and now. He might have even lost his life. At that moment, another member of the faction came rushing over, clutching a spatial ring in their hands. Seeing such a scene, they didn't even hesitate. They shot forward, ignoring the fallen youth and appearing at the edge of Lionel's formation. The spatial ring they were clutching flashed, revealing the form of a chain that snaked outward for hundreds of meters. Everywhere it passed, everything would be crushed to pieces. The youth grabbed onto the end of the chain with two hands, beads of sweat falling down their brows as they pulled hard. The chain whipped and writhed, eventually closing in around Lionel's formation like a winding tornado. Except this tornado was formed of chains and not wind. The sound of shattering glass and earth resounded, the formation Lionel had drawn into the ground splintering and splitting as cracks spread along its form. The chain squeezed forward, wrapping around the base of Elliot's stake and crushing it to pieces. Elliot fell, his body still limp. He had long since forced himself into a state of unconsciousness. The only good thing about Lionel's formation was that it decreased the concentration of anarchic force a small measure, making it just a bit more bearable, just enough for him to close his eyes. But, with a sudden jolt, he was awoken and a familiar pain shot through his body. He cried out as he crashed to the ground. The youth that had saved him wrestled with the chain whip before remembering that the spatial ring was specially designed for just this moment. After pouring their force into the ring, the chain whip let out a roar before it was unceremoniously pulled back, saving Elliot from the fate of being crushed. The members of the Green Thread faction rushed forward, however those with a more purposeful light in their eyes were faster. Their command Triana had given them ringing in their ears. Their only thoughts were of finding a chance to do things covertly. This was an even better opportunity than the lightning whip youth had managed to get. With things like this, there wouldn't even be a question. How could anyone this Elliot's own faction would castrate him? Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. At that moment, a powerful aura descended from the skies. In a single step, Cornelius had crossed the large distance, appearing above Elliot. A gentle wind pushed everyone out of the way as he appeared before Elliot's writhing body. He placed a palm upon the latter's head, causing the latter to fall into another deep sleep before checking his body. He really did only castrate a single testicle. Cornelius looked around. When his gaze met that of the youth, they looked away with guilty-ridden expressions. As a man who had experienced too much, Cornelius realized that he had really made it just in time. Unfortunately, there was no proof of any wrongdoing, so he could only let things slide. Cornelius shook his head. Just like his father, he refuses to explain anything even when people are helping him. This brat really will be my undoing. Cornelius didn't really have a choice. He had been tasked by the Void Elders to make sure that Lionel didn't cause too much upheaval, and he understood Velasco's temper quite well. If Lionel really did something wrong, Velasco likely wouldn't protect him. While part of the reason Cornelius was willing to mete out punishment to Lionel was because of his own sense of justice, another reason was that he knew that no one would blame him, including Velasco himself. Others might think that Velasco was like a looming threat constantly protecting Lionel's back, but Cornelius knew that Velasco was a man who didn't even lift a finger to bring his own brother out of a pit of despair, let alone his own son. That was just the kind of man he was. As long as things were done in an upright manner, he wouldn't even frown. However, if he sniffed even the slightest hint of subterfuge, well, Rosen, who had lost his arm, was a prime example of the consequences. This is good, the child hasn't been castrated, take him to be treated. With Cornelius having said this, the youths knew that their plans would no longer work. Nodding respectfully, they picked Elliot up and rushed away. Cornelius sighed. Sometimes I wonder if this is the right way to raise the youths. By the time they're old enough to make real decisions, these sorts of grudges won't be able to be erased. Cornelius shook his head. Clasping his hands behind his back, he vanished once more. With all the storms brewing around Lionel now, he should take some time to himself now, because he probably wouldn't get any more for a while into the future. Lionel and Aina blazed through the zones one after another, and soon news of their exploits began to spread. Matched with Lionel's battle with Jova and Mykarth, this seemed to propel them into a different sort of spotlight entirely. Soon, the pair only had their hardest mission remaining, and a new fire had been lit beneath the Void Palace Galaxy-ranked disciples. A calculative light flashed in Lionel's eyes as he thought of how he would best take advantage of this situation. Chapter 1484. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1484. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled a long breath, ruffling his hair. But it didn't carry its familiar volume and softness. Rather, it was heavy and wet, soaked through with his sweat. Even for him and Aina, taking on so many missions at once was definitely quite a challenge, especially since they had a time period to complete them all. Of course, they could have done it leisurely, but what would have been the point of that? Not only would they not gain the benefits of training without pushing themselves, but they'd also probably have to deal with more of Triana's nonsense during their break periods. The final two missions were the most challenging of the bunch. They had originally been level 5 and 6 galaxy-ranked missions respectively before they became void missions, and now they were both 3-star. One was related to goblins again, while the second was related to Rapax. Lionel realized that most galaxy-ranked missions seemed to be related to goblins, and this probably wasn't a coincidence. The dwarven race probably had the greatest variety in strength and, likewise, had the largest concentration of weaker groups and organizations to take advantage of. One shouldn't be fooled by the fact that Lionel and the others were sent into a Rapak's nest, if not for the severe weakening of the race, not to mention the interference of the three-finger cult. Even the Suyard family would have never taken such a risk. And yet, even then, they had to break the rules to do so. The dwarven race was probably the only one with similar average strength to humans. However, they were still above humans in the pecking order purely because they had an eighth-dimensional world and humans did not. One might wonder, then, why other races weren't planning to target the dwarven race like they would the human domain, and the answer to that was they had. In fact, they did so all the time. It was just that the dwarven race was exceptionally good at defense. When it came to guerrilla tactics, extending battles and schemes, the dwarven race was unmatched. Battling on their home field was like asking for death. When Lionel and Aina began tackling higher-level missions, they would no doubt include other high-level races. Just the fact that spirituals had a drawing dead level in the Void Tower already spoke volumes. Stepping over a final corpse, Lionel pushed through the vault of dwarven race. A year ago, Lionel and Aina had exited their first Void mission on the 4th day, but why was that? They had already finished scouting after the first day and should have wrapped up the mission during the second, so why did they take an extra 2 days to leave? The reason was simple, because you could take things out of a unique zone. The small shield that covered his privates wasn't the only thing Lionel had gotten out of that zone. In fact, he had spent the next 2 days trying to decode some of the dwarven race's force arts to see what he could glean from them. Unfortunately, the answer was not much. While you could take things out of this kind of unique zone, things could also easily become distorted. Information was among the worst things to pull out of a zone like this as it could easily lead you astray. However, Lionel was a hyper-analytical person. Finding faults and flaws was what he was best at. These distortions didn't bother him at all. Still, he hadn't been able to get much out of the first zone. If anything, the only benefit was that he got to spend more time teasing Aina, but there was nothing else aside from a small tidbit here and there. There was definitely nothing that could help him draw anything near as powerful as the formation that had kept him and Aina trapped. Lionel, though, didn't choose to give up. Every time they finished a dwarven race mission, he would take a look around to see if there was anything he could find, slowly cobbling together bits and pieces of a new language. He was sure that others had tried to do this before, he had even seen research papers in the Void Library about it. But there was nothing conclusive or holistic enough. Much like the spirituals could protect their intellectual secrets, so too could the goblins. In fact, they were even better at it. While spirituals were powerful purely because they were talented as a race overall, the goblins were different. They couldn't afford for their secrets to come out as it would have a huge impact on their whole race and even lead to their extinction. Everything they left behind was designed to destroy itself, and anything that was left was designed to mislead. Knowing this, it was unsurprising that even after going through over a dozen goblin void missions, Lionel still didn't find much of anything. Nothing again, huh? They're quite good at this, Lionel smiled, looking into the vault to find nothing but nonsense. What was left behind might as well have been a picture of the goblins mooning him. They were quite a funny and snarky race of people. Lionel couldn't help but laugh. If you really want to study this stuff, you'll probably have to go to their territory. Aina walked to his side, scanning the vault. Maybe if it was someone else, but your hubby is a special case. Aina rolled her eyes and ignored Lionel, just waiting for him to show off like he usually did. I realized something in the Void Tower while we were climbing. Don't you feel that it was a lot like a zone? Aina blinked before her brows furrowed. It's too different. Our bodies don't go in, but... Aina's irises flashed. It did feel a lot like a zone now that you say it. Lionel nodded. The feeling was vague because he hadn't been awake, but his dream force affinity was simply too high not to pick up on the similarities. It's just a theory for now, but I wonder if zones are projections of dream force. Just think about mythological zones for a second. How is it that fairy tales can become real? And why is it only that the most popular fairy tales manifest despite the fact that there are so many variations of them? What if it's a collective projection of a collective dream force of everyone who's ever read or told the story? After reaching a certain concentration, the zone is formed. After all, isn't dream force just consciousness? Aina's eyes glowed with a fiercer and fiercer light. Something about Lionel's words made her heart skip several beats, as though they were stumbling onto something they had no business touching at their current level. Aina had no idea just how true this was, and the kind of heft Lionel's statement carried with it. So what does this have to do with this zone? Well, history is not too different from fairy tales, are they? The only difference is that there were a large number of individuals who witnessed the event as it was, so it's more difficult to distort. Projections onto the past from the future won't be able to change what the reality was, so as such, there are very few changes. But, what about a unique zone like this? It's kept open for decades, centuries even, its resources continually plucked. As time passes, the original solid dream force becomes influenced by our future projections of what the truth was. As a result, they distort and all sorts of oddities can appear. Then, the facts become so skewed and ridiculous that it feels like we're in a dream, almost. But, what if you have a high enough dream force affinity to wade through this dream? Chapter 1485. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1485. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. If the Dominion disciples who had taken an interest in Lionel's stint at the Void Library could hear his words now, they would have been astonished. They were already aware why the Void Library and Void Tower placed so much emphasis on Dream Force, but they had already been in the Void Palace for decades, many over a century. How long had it taken them to piece information even close to this together, let alone finally be told by others and let into the fold? And yet, Lionel had been here for barely over a year, most of which was spent locked in a room ruminating over poetry, and yet he had already begun to draw such conclusions? In fact, it was correct to say that Lionel had figured this out almost the exact moment he woke up from his small coma. You want to use Dream Force to peer into the Dwarven race's secrets? Aina frowned. She wasn't a big fan of this. She already knew by now that Lionel had gotten stuck in a dream before. Though she didn't understand everything, she had her own deductions. Back then, Lionel had been stuck in a battle with the spiritual, and he was trying to use the opportunity to strengthen his soul. But the reality was that Lionel's soul hadn't even gone into the Void Tower, so how could this happen? Aina believed that Lionel was more aware than most others would be that he was in a virtual world. While others might be consciously aware that they were in the Void Tower with their minds and not their bodies, they still wouldn't feel any different. Lionel, however, should have been keenly aware of this difference, almost like a lucid dreamer. No, even deeper than a lucid dream, more like that odd state of wakefulness and sleep where you could still slip back into a dream whenever you wanted. Aina believed that because Lionel was so aware, he had ended up playing with fire. Fiddling around the connection had caused a catalyzation of dream force which even Lionel couldn't handle. Such a catalyzation would have led to an overload of sorts. On one hand, it would easily explain how Lionel had managed to make it to 7th dimensional floors. After all, with the dream force being distorted, anything could happen. This would also explain why the Void Tower was perfectly fine and no one else was implicated. On the other hand, it could also explain Lionel's injuries. With the line of reality and dream blurred, Lionel likely accidentally caused these injuries to him. Aina knew that she didn't have the whole story, because none of this could explain the massive changes to Lionel's mage core, or his sudden evolution into a starry-tailed fox, but she believed that this would describe at least 70 to 80% of what happened. As for the remaining 20%, maybe they would never know. It was precisely because of this, though, that Aina was worried. If Lionel started playing around with Dream Force again, what would happen this time? Before, it had been the Void Tower controlling the flow of Dream Force and Lionel was overwhelmed. How could he match up to Dream Force controlled by an entire zone, then? One was only capable of projecting a fake world, while the other was as real as it could get. You could even take things out of here. Of course, this was only the case if Lionel's deductions were correct. If zones had nothing to do with Dream Force at all, then there would be nothing to worry about. Lionel would just fail again and they could be on their merry ways. But if he was correct, yeah, don't you think it could work? Just imagine it. If my Dream Force affinity is high enough, then I could dig up any secret I want from a zone. There's already a precedent for this as well, no? Remember the Silver Empire? And how do empires like them have to distort their zones so that their enemies can't use them to dig up information about their secrets? Theoretically, if I can hone a technique capable of seeing through dream force distortions, then even such powerful families and empires couldn't hide anything from me so long as I can enter one of their zones. It's beyond that too. At a certain point, I'd never need to worry about failing a zone again. Even if I can't take control of the dream force outside of my body, just being able to see through it would make a lot of zones easy to clear. Lionel, stop, Aina said seriously. Lionel blinked, realizing that Aina was upset. What's wrong? You just got lost in your dream just a year ago, and that was just to the Void Tower. It's way too dangerous for you to be playing around with this stuff. What if, this time, you don't wake up? Aina's voice was quite stern, but it still carried its usual enchanting air. It was just that, this time, this air was tinged with the hint of a sob as though she was trying not to choke up. Lionel sighed before frowning a bit. It was hard to explain, but he felt very confident in doing this. He had already used the previous zones they had entered as a measuring stick in order to check a few of his hypotheses. This was why explaining things was such a headache. Now, he had worried her for no reason. Wouldn't it have been easier for him to just take on all the burden and show her the good results? Lionel scratched his head, the familiar sheen of sweat moistening his palms. Lionel was correct. It wasn't the Void Tower at all that had pulled him into such a state, it was something different. He and maybe the Void Elders were the only ones who knew this. But, it was difficult to explain in words, and it was another thing entirely if Aina would believe him. The exasperated side of Lionel just wanted to do it anyway, but he shook his head. If he kept doing this, then the rift between them would never fully close. Then, his eyes lit up with an idea. Without allowing Aina to protest, he took hold of her small hand. Chapter 1486. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1486. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It was only a matter of a thought. Lionel had originally designed this ability so that Aina would be able to use his ability index as a proxy to increase the range of her own ability index outside of her body. But, who said that powerful abilities couldn't be used to flirt? The moment Lionel held Aina's hand, he connected his starry spirit domain with hers, the feeling making her gasp out in shock. Back when Aina had connected with Yuri, the feeling was overwhelming and she instantly felt that her mind was tired. But, with Lionel taking on all the computing ability, it felt like she had gained Lionel's thinking speed, and she was quite speechless about what to say. Was this how fast Lionel talked all the time? No wonder he couldn't stand to explain things to people. By the time you understood his thought, he would have had 1,000 more. See? I'm confident. Aina blinked, feeling that Lionel really wasn't lying to her. But, she still felt a bit stubborn about it. If it wasn't the Void Tower, then what could have possibly caused it? Just keep holding my hand, she said defiantly. If you fall into a dream, we're falling into a dream together. That way, I can at least kick your ass until we starve to death or accidentally jump off the nearest building. Lionel laughed and obliged. It was fine by him, as far as he was concerned, he had gained big here. What was there to hate about holding a maiden's hand? Soon, though, Lionel had already turned his attention back to the vault, 3 illusory tails blooming to his back as he forced his starry spirit domain to expand. With a range of 5 meters, he could only touch upon a fraction of the space around him, but he already had areas that he wanted to focus on. Lionel closed his eyes. He didn't need his eyes to see everything around him as clear as day. In fact, everything within his starry spirit domain was even clearer than when he used his eyes alone. Nothing could compare. Every small little detail was reflected back to him, every nook and cranny being scanned and stored into his dream world. He focused more and more. What he had now was too surface level, too shallow. He needed to get deeper, into the very essence of the location itself, reaching beyond just the images, and into what constructed them. Everything was formed of force at some level, especially at the highest dimensions. Only the third dimension could get away with the simplicity of physics and chemistry to explain everything. Upon touching the quasi-fourth dimension, everything changed. Lionel could feel the variant earth forces that made up the ground and walls. He could sense the wind force circulating through the air. The wood force sustained the vitality of the chairs. There were all sorts of oddities like this and he picked up on them all. However, Lionel realized instantly that if he was in the outside world, such a thing would have been impossible for him. He might have been able to sense the variant earth forces, but wind and wood force? He didn't have the affinity necessary. That was when it clicked for Lionel, his lips curling into a smile. The reason he could sense these forces here was that it wasn't these forces at all. Rather, it was dream force masquerading itself. It was no wonder Lionel could sense it all so clearly. This wasn't the true embodiment of these forces at all, rather it was just how most people would view them. No, it isn't that simple. If it weren't a true embodiment, then everyone who entered a zone, so long as they had at least one decent affinity, they would feel that something was off. Unless, since dream force was a representation of consciousness, could it be that everyone who entered a zone was just fooled? Even if they had a high affinity, they would be tricked into thinking this dream force was the true form of their favorite force. If things are like that, then, Lionel's mind sunk deeper. He had spent time looking for dream force, but his approach had been wrong from the very beginning. Everything he was dream force. In that case, what he should be doing wasn't looking for dream force. Instead, he should already be parsing apart what he was seeing. He would just treat everything like it was dream force. The first thing Lionel tried to do was manipulate the dream force around him, but as he had already expected, it was impossible. His ability index wasn't designed to work like that and he seemed to be shackled from doing so. He could project his dream force out and into his starry spirit domain, but he couldn't take control of the dream force that was already here. However, Lionel wasn't worried about this. If he could actually do such a thing, he could probably cause the entire zone to collapse. That was something that he wasn't sure if he would be able to control properly. But, this was within what he could do. Instead of taking control of the dream force, he used his affinity with it to peer into its secrets. Lionel was able to perfectly reconstruct every scene within a 5-meter radius of him. After reconstructing it, he was able to insert a 100% clone into his dream simulation. And then, he could rewind the clock. The higher the dimension, the more difficult it was for Lionel to use his dream simulation ability. Usually, he had millions of constraints he had to deal with and the things he could simulate were pretty much within his body and his body alone. This made sense. If Lionel wanted to simulate something, he needed a perfect understanding of something. The less comprehension he had, the worse the simulation. But now that everything around him was constructed of dream force, how could he possibly have a limited understanding of it? A wild grin spread across Lionel's face as a force art that had long since been destroyed began to reform in his mind. Chapter 1487. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1487. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The closer Lionel got to the finished product, the paler he seemed to become. But, even then, his gaze glowed brighter and brighter. It was working, it was truly working. Lionel's breathing was heavy, but his vision suddenly started to go black. Lionel. Lionel. Lionel shot up, a spurt of blood coming from his nose and dripping down his lips. He quickly wiped it away, his head behind swallowed up by a mind-splitting headache. It took Lionel several moments for his eyes to focus, but when they finally did, his expression twisted into a frown. He had failed. Are you okay? Aina looked Lionel up and down, only sighing in relief when he seemed to be intact. But then, she too, began to frown. I told you it was dangerous. Lionel shook his head. I was never in danger of falling into a dream, the problem is something else. I just tried to reconstruct a force art that was beyond me. If it wasn't 7th dimensional, then it was definitely near the peak of the 6th dimension. It's beyond me to reconstruct something like that, not until I step into 6th dimension. In truth, Lionel had been close. But, in this case, close wasn't close enough. With the way this ability of his worked, or rather, Dream Rewind, if he reached a barrier he couldn't cross, then nothing he could do now would allow him to cross it. He had been too ambitious and picked inappropriately. It was already difficult to keep Starry Spirit Domain fully active. To layer Dream Rewind on top of that was like asking for pain. He could only admit that he had done this to himself. Eventually, Lionel chuckled. "Don't be like that, you know it wasn't that dangerous. It's just a bloody nose and a light headache, it'll be gone in half an hour or so. Instead, we should focus on finding things that we can take advantage of. I bit off more than I can chew, but there definitely are things here that we can benefit from. Think about it. The dwarven race, despite being physically weaker than maybe even humans, have been able to defend themselves for so long. They definitely have a lot of things that we can learn from." After reading all those fourth-dimensional books of the Void Library, Lionel's foundational knowledge didn't lack to most anyone. Not only was he now aware of more intricate details, he was also now aware that the term goblin race was derogatory, so he took heed to not use it. If there was anything his stint in the Raypack's nest had taught him, it was that even if other races thought differently from humans and had their own cultures, they were still living beings with the same amount of sentience as humans. There was, of course, the question of beasts. But Lionel didn't feel that he was ready to go vegan just yet. Aina shook her head. This man was pale-faced and looked like he had a foot in the grave, but he was still talking about such nonsense. If she had a mirror right now, she'd definitely stick it in his face and tell him to take a nice long look. "Don't give me that face, let me lie here for a little longer." Lionel rested his head on Aina's lap again, dozing off. Toward this, she could only helplessly remain silent. An hour later, Lionel awoke, feeling energized. Again. This time, since Aina understood the process, he didn't have to take her hand. Part of the reason he failed was that he had to process her thoughts as well. And, because she had access to his ability, she had been thinking no slower than him. However, despite this, Lionel didn't try the same force art again. He knew it was beyond him. Aina or not, he would have still failed. Instead, he targeted something simpler. Using his dream simulation, he separated out powerful force arts from the weaker ones. If he was correct, there was a chance that he could go back and try the complicated one later. Ultimately, the reason it was so difficult to complete the high-level force art was that he had no experience with dwarven race force arts. He started from zero, trying to build the very top of a skyscraper. However, if he started with weaker force arts first, there should be some portions he would be able to fill in without relying on Dream Rewind, thus taking the brunt of the pressure off of the ability itself and making the process easier. Here, found something. Lionel found the scraps of what was once a tome. The elaborate cover was still intact, but when you opened it, there was nothing more than a pile of ashes. Clearly, the pages had combusted and destroyed themselves. The dwarven race is truly ruthless with their stuff. So much destruction, and not a single one is identical. But, that much is fine. This is the perfect target. I'll start with just the first page or two. As it builds up, it'll naturally become easier to complete the latter portions. Lionel took a breath, focusing his mind. Then, he began once more. This time, he was determined to succeed. Dream Rewind. Lionel had 4 more days left in this zone. Even if he had to take a few hours break between each use of Dream Rewind, he would still be able to gain a lot. The truth was that Lionel wasn't doing this to gain strength. He hadn't even touched a single % of the knowledge the Void Palace had to offer him just yet. He hadn't even learned about the God Path. It didn't make much sense, then, for him to be so obsessed with the knowledge wells of other races when he hadn't even fully understood humankind. However, the dwarven race had fascinated him. And, if there was anything Lionel was good at, it was obsessing over things that fascinated him. What he didn't know was that this fascination on his part would earn him a clue towards stepping beyond poetry and grasping the faint truths of music, a secret that the dwarven race had done too well in hiding. Chapter 1488. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM Chapter 1488 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After several minutes, the first page successfully formed, then the second, and finally the third. With each formation, Lionel's face grew paler, but he still managed to hold on. When the 17th page was formed, Lionel's vision finally swam again, turning to blackness. Lionel fell into another deep sleep, waking up a couple of hours later to a familiar soft lap. Aina glared down at him, but he only grinned. That was only 17 pages out of about 1,000. However, the more pages he cleared, the faster he should be able to go through them. The time they had remaining should be just enough. Lionel hurriedly stood up again, taking Aina's hand and bringing her to the side of the tome. With a movement, he flipped open the cover, opening up to the first page. In truth, he didn't have to do this. Because he had already reconstructed it, the pages were seared into his mind. He wanted Aina to stop pouting, so he brought her over to show just how worth it the pain was. So long as they got something out of it, wasn't it worth it? Look at this seems to be a floor plan for the castle. They probably had to keep records so certain officials could know where all the traps were and how best to take advantage of them. It's a double-edged sword in that way. They have a lot of tricks up their sleeves, but if their own aren't prepared to deal with and handle all of them, then it's all meaningless. If they end up harming themselves, then it would be counterproductive. The first 5 or so pages were all floor plans marked with various labels. Each of these labels denoted a different trap and a trap category. But this wasn't the best part of the tome at all. When Lionel flipped to the 6th page, his eyes lit up, and he squeezed Aina's hand. He looked like a kid on Christmas Day, finally receiving the present he had been asking for months. As expected, the floor plan wasn't enough. Not only did this tome note where the traps were, but they also noted what type of trap it was and how to maintain it. In addition, there were even logs for the frequency of maintenance needed and the last time such maintenance occurred. This is the first type of trap, it's under the false wall label and is like that trap we ran into a year ago. It was really cleverly set up and could catch a person off guard. So this is the force art behind it. Lionel's eyes glowed. Force arts were a mysterious thing. Just being able to see through one and understand its function didn't mean you could understand how it was built and what foundation it relied upon. One might wonder how Lionel was able to see through the truths of a formation he couldn't personally construct, but those that thought this way had a misunderstanding about force arts. You could consider force arts like code and their function to be the program or software that was being executed. There were hundreds of programming languages, many of which could perform the exact same task and result in the same product. For a force art language he didn't recognize, Lionel was able to surf the constructed website or delve into the programmed game, but he couldn't see the source code or even begin to decipher it. At best, he would be able to tell what sort of general steps he might have to take with his own coding language to reproduce the same effects. However, much like with coding languages, force art languages weren't all created equal. Just because a language could do something, didn't mean it should. Some were far more of a hassle to use for certain tasks than others would, and this was yet another example. The Luxnix force art language was very good at giving life to force arts. In fact, this wasn't just for the snowy star owl. Lionel had learned long ago that this force art language originated from the bronze tablet, and it had many more secrets he had yet to uncover. Likewise, the dwarven race force art language was exceptionally good at the formation of traps, deception, and defending. Lionel could, somewhat, understand the underlying secrets of the Luxnix force art language. However, the dwarven force art language was entirely foreign to him. So, when he finally laid eyes on it, he couldn't help but lose himself in a trance. Seeing Lionel like this, despite her earlier dissatisfaction, Aina couldn't help but smile. She especially liked when Lionel became like this. Despite her having wasted a year in that training room with him, she didn't feel like it was a waste at all. Watching Lionel's work was a guilty pleasure of hers. This, as Lionel flipped through the pages, his heart beat wildly, and his shock only increased. Lionel had seen the force arts of the spirituals race. Well, he had seen bits and pieces of it. Still, He was absolutely certain that there was no force art that could surpass it, at least at the time. Their force art system was simply too perfect, too without flaw. Despite Lionel being certain that it had only been optimized for strengthening the soul, it could accomplish so much more. He could fathom what the language the spirituals used for crafting would look like, and he had even been eager to see it. But, when Lionel laid eyes on the intricacies of the dwarven race's force arts, he froze in place. At first, he was just excited. But, as more time passed, the light in his eyes faded, and his mind became more and more focused. Eventually, a dense auspicious air began to waft from his body, building up like a cloud of dark gold. Lionel's finger rose up, and he drew a line across the air, a thin wire of force following his movements. When he stopped, a hum resonated through the silent vault. Chapter 1489. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1489. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had learned a lot from his time in the Void Library. Among the fourth-dimensional information he had learned about, he had read a lot about the culture of the dwarven race. He had learned about their love of darkness and the underground, he had learned about their mating rituals and practices, their love of nature, and he had also learned about their love of music. It was said that the dwarven race built their homes into mountains not just for darkness and safety, but also because it gave them the greatest control over the architecture. The dwarven race didn't build their homes, they sculpted them. By taking this approach, they were able to form a sort of resonance with the earth. The sounds traveled perfectly, better than even the greatest concert halls of Earth. Although Lionel had never heard it, he learned that the dwarven race were known for their beautiful voices and that they were even able to use their wings to tune to their pitch and warp their sound. Oddly enough, they didn't have to make or design any instruments of their own, insisting on using nature and their bodies as their two only mediums. Lionel hadn't thought much about this when he read it. He had only been focused on consuming as much information as he could so that he could find the information he needed to save the segmented cube from a lifetime of being a paperweight. But, when he had begun reading through the tome this time around, his dreamscape sparked. Usually, when Lionel's dreamscape leaped into action, it would connect him to some big discovery. But, this time, it just kept reminding him about these seemingly useless facts again and again. And that was when Lionel finally noticed. "Aina, hum this for me." Aina blinked. She wasn't a very artistic person either. In that way, she and Lionel were a perfect match. In fact, she was actually even less artistic than Lionel, since at least this boyfriend of hers was quite good at talking. She wasn't even able to do that. Aina was quite aware that in their clashes of wit, Lionel often let her win. If not for this, she would probably never come out on top in a war of words with this man. This was only further confirmed after she learned how fast Lionel's mind worked. By the time she finished a single retort, Lionel would have probably thought of 100 more. Seeing Aina hesitating, the coldness and focus in Lionel's gaze receded as he looked over and smiled. "What, nervous?" Seeing that Lionel was still in the mood to tease her, Aina rolled her eyes. "I've never sung before, I don't even know if I could do it." Aina bit her lip. She didn't have memories of it, but her father told her that her mother was quite fond of singing. This wasn't something that she had thought about in a very long time, a long-lost memory that had only just dusted itself off. It left her heart feeling somewhat heavy. However, when she felt the warmth of Lionel's hands, she felt more assured. She leaned to the side, resting her cheek on his shoulder for a moment as they stood. "I, for one, think it would be a shame if that beautiful voice of yours never sang." Aina smiled. "Oh please, you've never asked me for this before. Clearly, you just want to use me for your little experiment." Her heart already felt much lighter like this, she no longer minded as much. Lionel meant his words, though. Ever since her curse had been lifted, the beauty and charm of Aina's voice had really come through. Back then, when she hadn't been able to control her innate coercion, she made people hold on to her every word. But, in recent times, that coercion had been reined in, and she never saw Aina use it again. Now that the topic had come up, he somewhat wondered about it. "Okay, I just need to match the tone, right?" "I'll try." Though Aina said this, she didn't think it would be too hard. Both she and Lionel had great control over their bodies, something like outputting an even tone and notes shouldn't be difficult. Let your coercion free too, Lionel suddenly said. Aina blinked when she heard this, her soft lips already partially parted. After a brief hesitation, she chose to do as Lionel asked, the caution in her gaze replaced by the reassurance of the man by her side. Lionel drew another line through the air, and a hum echoed. But not long later, he felt as though his bones had gone soft, the delicate drifting sound of Aina's voice matching the pitch perfectly. Even long after the hum had vanished, Aina's voice continued to carry over. Lionel hadn't said how long she needed to go for, but as a fifth-dimensional existence, Aina could go quite some time with a sustained breath. It was only after nearly half a minute sounded that Lionel snapped out of it, his heart still trembling. At that moment, he could decide. Was his girlfriend a human, a vampire, or a siren? Lionel quickly shook his head and focused. With the projection of his dream world, he gained many abilities. He had always had a near-perfect memory, even to the point he could arrange it all into dreamscapes. However, now with the projection of his dream world into the outside world, he could take the things in his mind and present them to others. This meant that if Lionel wanted, he could also release his memories for all to see, like a perfect replay of things he had experienced. Lionel took the memory of Aina's singing and stored it before drawing another line and having her sing it at will. Time ticked by, and the pair went through hundreds of lines, Aina's voice not faltering once. If the pop stars of Earth's third dimension knew they could have such an ability, they just might kill for it. Then, the final line was drawn, and Lionel finally let Aina have a rest. In one swift motion, Lionel drew all of the lines once more, but this time, there wasn't a single hum. Until, he released his memories of Aina's singing all at once. Chapter 1490. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1490. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The symphony of Aina's voices layered atop of one another, the resonance shaking one deep down to the very soul. The first thing Lionel realized was that he hadn't been able to capture Aina's coercion perfectly and that some tweaks would be necessary. The memories were clearly only infused with his memory of the sound, but not what happened to the rest of his body. But, even with just that alone, the result was astonishing. The simple force art Lionel had drawn in the air, too small to make an impact, and much too lacking in energy to change this even if it was much larger, suddenly began to shine brightly. The force art was nothing more than a palm size at first, but it explosively increased in diameter, doubling in size, and then doubling again in quick succession. Before it could grow any further or become any brighter, Lionel was forced to cut off the replay of Aina's voice, his heart doing flips. Just now, without nothing more than a few hums, a force he had spent no more than a drop of energy on became so powerful, even if there was nothing else to gain here, this sort of discovery was too insane. If Lionel had the ability to reproduce this with every force art he ever crafted, would he even ever need to worry about running out of stamina again? He would practically be able to battle forever so long as he didn't fall asleep on the battlefield or die of hunger first. This was crazy. Lionel's mind practically short-circuited. He couldn't understand how it worked. How could voice alone cause such a change? And this was with him messing up Aina's coercion. What if he was able to layer it together? Aina, If we created an attack together that worked on this concept, we could probably kill a quasi-seventh dimensional expert without much difficulty. Aina fell into silence, not responding. She felt that this was quite fantastical, too, and she didn't quite understand what was going on. How could sounds produce such an effect? Lionel was baffled into silence until he slowly began to understand. It was all about resonance. Why was Lionel able to teleport out of that Rapak's nest? It definitely wasn't based on his own strength. He was forced to use the life force of the green waters around them to have the impact he wanted. If he relied on his own force, they would have never gotten out of there. The dwarven race seemed to use a similar concept, but it was on a completely different level. Lionel was only able to draw in so much life force because there was already such a large concentration of it on the ground. On top of that, it was created from the corpses of seventh-dimensional Raypaks, so they were even more powerful. However, the force art language of the dwarven race acted very differently. Each line drawn had its own intricate resonance. Alone, they were nothing special. However, when they were brought together as one, they formed a special resonance with the surroundings that seemed to perfectly match the runes of the force art itself. When this perfect balance was struck, the force art became able to pull in more power from the surroundings, no longer needing to rely on its crafter. Usually, this effect wasn't too exaggerated. However, if you added in Aina's voice, the resonance seemed to be shocked with stimulants, suddenly forcing it to explosively increase in both size and strength. It's no wonder this force art system is so good for traps and defense. The best trap is one that perfectly blends into the environment, and the best defense is one that's not only persistent but also self-healing and self-reliant. With this sort of resonance, the traps are able to more seamlessly blend into the environment. If it's tuned and designed for a specific location, a lot like the dream force around here, it can even mimic other forces and remain inconspicuous. I have a feeling the reason I didn't notice the force art trap in the throne room at that time is about more than just the fact they were drawn on seventh-dimensional materials. Even if it was drawn on sixth or even fifth-dimensional materials, I would have had a hard time finding it. It's just that the dwarven race is very clever. They lured us into a false sense of security, making it seem that their traps could be detected with a bit of extra focus before they sprung the real trap on us. We're very lucky. I have a feeling that these zones do the dwarven race a huge disservice. Because of the dream force distortions, their traps are easier to detect because the resonance isn't as perfectly tuned. Lionel mumbled his thoughts out loud, but he soon found that speaking was far too slow, and he fell into silence again. At that moment, Lionel had a maddening realization. If he were to compare the spiritual to the dwarven race, the former of which was both endlessly beautiful and elegant, not to mention seen as the pinnacle of soul and force arts in the dimensional verse. He actually believed that the dwarven race surpassed the spirituals by no small measure. Lionel realized that he had stumbled into a treasure. However, as much as he thought this, he also realized just how difficult it would be to replicate the feat of the dwarven race. They lived and breathed nature, they were all too familiar with using the environment and their bodies as instruments. Their innate comprehension of such things surpassed Lionel by leaps and bounds. Simply put, if Lionel had to create his own dwarven force art, there was no way he could right now. The only thing he could do was a copy. For someone like Lionel, the idea of this left him feeling uncomfortable. The idea of something he didn't quite understand was itching at him. But he knew that this was the path he had always wanted. Using force arts as the vessel of artistry. Lionel had thought that he would always start with calligraphy first, but he never thought that he would run into the answer for music long before that. If he wanted to find that ever-elusive fourth step, he needed to be able to first replicate the feat of his uncle and grandfather with his force arts, only then could he take the next step. Lionel grit his teeth, putting his pride down. Since he didn't understand for now, fine. He would copy. He would copy as much as he could find until the inspiration hit him like a bolt of lightning. Chapter 1491. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1491. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. So, that was what Lionel did. Not standing on ceremony, he pilfered everything he could find, hoping that he would make some sort of breakthrough. But, for the first time, it actually came quite slow to him. He didn't understand much about music theory. What made notes sound good together, what was harmony, he didn't even know what a scale was. Music wasn't really a path followed in the dimensional verse, maybe because it was too complex, or maybe because many didn't really see a point. There seemed to be a force for everything, but there was no such thing as music force, the same way there was no such thing as art force or painting force. Instead, such existences were amalgamations of other force applied in seemingly useless ways. Music force was just a different application of vibrational forces that sounded good to the ear, but there was no set music force. Rather, there was no such thing at all. It was a seemingly silly application of something that was otherwise greatly useful. The dwarven race, however, was able to break through this uselessness and find something far deeper hidden within, and this was what greatly fascinated Lionel. At the same time, it taught him a valuable lesson. Lionel didn't like wasting time on things that didn't seem to make logical sense to him. If it couldn't be explained, then it was a mostly useless endeavor. This sort of philosophy governed most of the things he did, even down to his own moral doctrines and how he valued life itself. However, if Lionel were to make a guess at how exactly the dwarven race had stumbled onto such a wonderful force art language, he would have to admit that there was no way they had seen the truth from the very beginning. In all likelihood, the dwarven people only sang because they liked it, they formed their homes with acoustics in mind because they loved it, they had researched music to its very end, despite its uselessness, purely because they had a passion for it. Then, like on a day many years ago, one of their greatest geniuses, or maybe even a collection of them, finally made the breakthrough that allowed the race to place their stamp on the dimensional verse and protect themselves. Who knew how many generations it had taken? If Lionel had been among their people, he would have probably been among the first to say just how much of a waste of time it was. But could he say this now? Of course not. Lionel wondered just how many things could be like this. But he also wondered just how many useless things would never shine in this way in the end. Was it that they wouldn't shine? Or was it that there was never someone great enough born with enough accumulation and investment to their back, to force it to? Lionel wasn't sure what the answer was. Were all things inherently useful or useless? Or could everything be made useful so long as the greatest extremes were taken? He truly didn't know. He could only find himself suddenly staring ahead at a blank road. Even when his uncle sat him down to pass down something his grandfather had likely spent a lifetime perfecting, his first thought was to run away. "Aina, do I not take things seriously enough?" Lionel asked. Aina blinked, not answering immediately. Lionel was, indeed, sometimes too free of a spirit. The only time he really got serious about anything was when he was mad or enraged by something, and these days, the only thing that could push him over the edge like that were things related to Aina. Even when his father was threatened by Mykarth, Lionel was necessarily enraged. His gaze went cold, but at best, he just focused a bit more. Lionel's belief in his own father was simply far too high and far too great. Someone like Mykarth taking his father's life was far too much of a joke. He didn't even care enough to muster the energy to get mad. Of course, if Mykarth had been a member of the Three-Finger Cult, it would be a different matter entirely. Lionel had never seen his dad be anything other than a sarcastic prankster all his life. The old man seemed to only have a single constant mood. But Lionel would never forget the look in his father's eyes when he said those three words. The rage, the fury, the willingness to watch the world burn. This was precisely why Lionel lost control of his temper when he learned that the Three-Finger Cult was present, to the point that he didn't rest until he had killed them all. But what about when Lionel wasn't enraged? Or what about when the lives of those he cared about weren't on the line? It's not that you don't take things seriously enough, it's that there's nothing you take seriously at all. With that head of yours, you think that there doesn't exist a situation you can't think your way out of, and maybe that's true. To have that sort of ingrained confidence isn't something most others could hope to have, it's just that you have too much of it, and the only person who can seem to put a lid on that confidence of yours is your dad. Aina hadn't understood this initially, as she too was confused about why it was that it only took a word from Lionel's father for him to suddenly do a 180 and even kiss her. However, after connecting to Lionel's mind again and again, and seeing how he thought, it finally clicked for her. In truth, I feel that the reason you were so easily able to abandon me is that you never doubted your ability to win me back when you were ready. Maybe you never thought about it in so many words. Aina's gaze shifted toward Lionel, a half-threatening light within them. If Lionel had so explicitly thought such a thing, she would definitely teach him a lesson, even if it might have been true. But it's not normal for someone to so release their hold on their emotions so easily unless there was such a reason. Too confident. What was he supposed to do about that, exactly? Chapter 1492. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1492. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. He was so confident in himself that he even thought he could toy with Ana's emotions as he pleased and still get her back. Did he really think like that? Lionel frowned, finding the words hard to accept. But he didn't immediately reject them either. Whether they were true or not, just the fact that Ana felt that way meant that it was important for him to take her seriously. He would either have to address such a thing head-on, or he would have to convince her that this wasn't true. The trouble was that if even he wasn't sure, then how could he go about convincing her? Plus, it wasn't like he could just lie to her. He didn't want to break her trust any more than he already had. There was also the fact that they often connected their minds as well. Lionel just fell into silence. Was he such a person? Did he carry such a dangerous mentality? If Lionel was honest with himself, the answer to that question was most definitely yes. As for proof of that, didn't he just need to look at his own moral compass? Why was it that he was such a moral individual? Many would think it was because he had a soft heart, or he was inherently virtuous, or he just believed in the sanctity of human life and life itself. These would be the reasons most would give to such a thing. But Lionel was a different sort of beast altogether. Soft heart? He had never had one. Virtuous? He couldn't be considered that either. The sanctity of human life? What kind of nonsense was that? Lionel had always had the very same reason. Because he couldn't logically deduce an objective metric for the worth of a life, he decided that everyone, regardless of status, was equal. It was as simple as that. He wasn't a saint, he wasn't virtuous, he didn't have a soft heart. In fact, it could be said that he was quite cold. When he first entered the Mayan tomb, and he made it all the way to the end, all to finally kill the priest and nearly lose his life to that teenage girl who was about to be sacrificed, one might think that he truly was soft-hearted, and maybe in practice he was, but foundationally? He didn't think so. To that teenage girl, Lionel had just killed the priest who was about to give her people, and most importantly, her family, peace and prosperity. She was already ready to give her life for this cause, but Lionel had swooped in with his own ideologies and imposed them onto her. In fact, it was worse than that. Lionel ruined their ritual because he simply didn't have a choice. If he wanted to go home, he had to kill the priest. It was inherently a selfish desire that had brought him to that point, and he felt guilt about it. Why should he get to go home, and yet this young girl's life would forever be ruined? Who knew what kind of punishment she and her family would face after the death of the priest? Lionel might have made a terrible situation several times worse. Guilt. That was right, he had felt guilt. But, wasn't that an emotion? Wasn't he logical to a fault? He was. The difference was that while others felt emotion based on ingrained biases, Lionel's moral code was decided by his own deductions and the two words his father had instilled in him from his youth. Respect and persistent. This was why Lionel was so fascinated by his emotions for Ana. They didn't make much sense, they bloomed from nowhere, and she seemed to have latched onto him in a way no one else could. In fact, the first time Lionel felt that he had acted irrationally was also due to Ana, speaking those disrespectful words in the presence of so many people and violating one of his own core doctrines, respect. Lionel's brows furrowed deeper. He didn't quite understand what to do. Lionel hadn't spent a lot of time with his mother, but she had said something quite profound during one of their conversations. It was quite simple: when someone shows you who they are, believe them. People don't change unless they want to. Even though she loved his father, she never entertained him, not until he showed his own willingness to change. Lionel had always naively believed, though, that he was quite good at adapting to the situation. So long as he had enough information to logically change his position, he didn't mind changing. He even thought that he had done this many times already. But was that even true? It took Anya saying something for him to realize that he was ruining a lot of his relationships with organizations on his own. And, even when she pointed it out to him, did he suddenly turn a new leaf? Not really. He was still the same person. And now, it took Ana saying something about this for him to realize where the core of the issue lay. Was he too confident? No, it shouldn't be called confidence, he was arrogant. He had an overinflated ego, and he wasn't even sure if he had the ability to rein in it. What worried him the most was that what if there really did come a day when he couldn't just think his way out of something? It would be too late to do anything by then. However, this was most definitely a humbling experience. A race even weaker than the humans had managed to become so powerful by following a path Lionel would have sworn up and down was just useless. This was just his first stint into the wider dimensional verse. Who knew how many things there were out there that he couldn't possibly wrap his head around? Maybe there were things even more fantastical than this that he had never laid his eyes on. Still, just like Alienor had said, a person changing wasn't a simple matter at all. In fact, if Lionel began to uncover the truths behind these things he couldn't understand, wouldn't his confidence only grow? Chapter 1493. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1493. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina chuckled. If you weren't overconfident, then you wouldn't be you. Lionel was speechless. Was I always like this? Do you think it's normal for someone to confess to a person over 500 times? Aina blinked innocently as though she wasn't poking at a sore spot. Lionel coughed, not knowing what to say. Did that even take confidence? He never really thought much about it, he just wanted to hear a real answer from her. If she had given him a sign that she didn't want it, then he wouldn't have even done it twice, let alone over 500 times. Seeing Lionel's reaction, Aina rolled her eyes. Most people struggle to do it even once. And, if they get rejected, they might not try again in their lifetime, let alone being persistent for so long. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Why do you sound so familiar with how this works? Aina smiled, flipping her hair. Do you think you're the only one to have ever confessed to me? I'm quite popular, you know. Lionel choked on air, his head spinning toward Aina to the point he almost forgot that he was still working on a dream rewind right this moment. Aina's eyelashes fluttered innocently as though she hadn't said anything at all. Lionel was a man who had shattered the glasses of the Grand Prime Minister's son just because he had looked at Aina for a second too long. It was safe to say that under normal circumstances, he was quite the jealous man. However, Aina continued to smile as though she hadn't said anything. Wasn't this what he got for being so confident as to think she would always be obediently waiting for him? Even if it was true, he wasn't allowed to think about it. She had her own pettiness, no image, to uphold. Who? Lionel asked. What, are you going to go beat them up? Yes. Lionel nodded vigorously, causing Aina to burst into a fit of laughter. She doubled over, holding her stomach. If it wasn't for the binding around her chest, who knew what sort of undulation such heart laughter would have caused? Eventually, Lionel managed to finish under Aina's teasing, the very first force art he had failed to complete finally forming under his gaze. Seeing it now, his eyes couldn't help but glow. He had actually managed to finish it without passing out. Though, he felt that this was actually in part due to his mind becoming more robust. This is the formation that trapped us before? Aina asked. It's similar, very similar. I have to believe that the dwarven race probably spread this out to all their core strongholds. This one is a bit stronger. So long as we set it up, we won't have to ever worry about our home being burned down again. As Lionel said this, his gaze flashed with a cold light. It was clear that he hadn't forgotten about this in the slightest. He would definitely make Triana cough up his payback by 100-fold. The only trouble with this is that it needs precious metals to resonate with in order to display its greatest strength. In addition, we'll need to sculpt the beasts with precious metals as well. Their strength will also be decided by how much we invest. Lionel's brows furrowed. The more precious the metal, the more difficult it was to sculpt. The foundational piece was simple enough, it could just be a slab or metal with the force art carved into it. But the beast sculptors were more complicated. The force art itself already had certain precise parameters that needed to be met so that the resonance would work properly. If even a single thing was off, the strength wouldn't be properly displayed. That was just the first issue, the main problem was something else. Lionel already knew that this wouldn't be anywhere near the best the dwarven race had to offer, but seeing it now, he realized just how true this was. The original formation had been drawn onto seventh-dimensional materials. This was the initial reason Lionel had thought of for explaining why he couldn't sense them before finding out the truth. However, the fact didn't change at all. What was the issue? This formation resonated with seventh-dimensional materials, yet it only displayed sixth-dimensional strength. This was more than just a little disappointing, and though Lionel had expected it, he still couldn't help but sigh. For a formation that required seventh-dimensional materials to only display such strength, wasn't it too pitiful? It was clear that dwarven race had done this on purpose. Lionel couldn't have been more correct. It had to be remembered that the dwarven race was in the same position as the humans previously. Everyone eyed their territory due to their weakness, and they were forced into a defensive position. In such a situation, how could they have sent a powerful offensive into the human domain? These zones represented points in the past where the dwarven race sent forward a vanguard of some of their weakest, just to probe the situation. They didn't send their most powerful, nor did they send their best resources. This was another reason why their zones were concentrated in the lower ranks of the Void Palace. This is still salvageable. If I get strong sixth-dimensional materials, match the resonance perfectly, and then stack it with Aina's voice, I should be able to squeeze out more strength than they did. Lionel nodded to himself. He would have to study these thoroughly. Since this would probably be the best he could find in these zones, he had no choice but to go all out with what he had. He didn't believe that he would be able to find the secret hidden within these. Lionel and Aina finally made their way out of the zone on the final day. Surprisingly, there was no one waiting for them outside, something they had gotten used to. It seemed that the Green Thread faction was still licking its wounds. They made it to the closest Senate branch and exchanged all their missions at once. It was time for their real counterattack to begin. Chapter 1494. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1494. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 3,750 golden tickets, next at 5250. You want to buy a property next to a Senate branch? Dimitri looked at Lionel and Aina again. Was it possible for these two to do something a bit more normal? Even in the weakest areas frequented only by quadrant-ranked disciples cost tens of millions. And, most of them were controlled by level 7 galaxy-ranked disciples at the worst. The location was simply too valuable. Even if there were only low-ranked disciples around, the amount you would make would accumulate pretty quickly so long as your service was decent. Even for a top-tier galaxy-ranked disciple, just the sheer volume would be able to total into a nice sum by the end of the month. Usually, after buying such a location, you'd be able to make your money back in about half a year to a year, and that was just the average. If you became popular, you'd be far faster. So, one can imagine the kind of money large factions with entire territories to themselves were raking in. I believe that we should be able to challenge a landowner for their spot, correct? Lionel asked to confirm, ignoring Dimitri's shock. In truth, he, of course, already knew the answer to this question. It was just that he would need to get the right to challenge permit from Dimitri as well. Luckily, the permit was much less expensive, just a single merit and 100,000 points. It was just a high enough bar that most wouldn't dare to casually use it. After all, you couldn't just allow one to randomly challenge as they pleased. If such a thing was fine, then wouldn't a store owner never get any rest? This price, though, was only for someone challenging a store owner above their rank. The price increased exponentially the higher rank you were in comparison to your target. In this way, the Void Palace maintained some of its fairness as well. Alright. I'm already tired of questioning the two of you anyway. Just do what you want, so long as you don't break the rules. Dimitri began preparing the permit before he suddenly thought of something. Shouldn't you apply for Galaxy rank now? The requirements for reaching Galaxy rank from level 9 quadrant rank were pretty straightforward. Lionel had already covered most of it. He had already gathered more than enough combat merits, the part most people found the hardest. Now, he just needed to complete the two other requirements. The first was to accumulate what was called civilian merits and the second was to break into the sixth dimension using the God Path. Civilian merits were merits gained through non-combat means. They could refer to contributing to research, joining a secondary profession faction, and completing a certain list of tasks, or it could be something as simple as starting a storefront and accumulating points through it. So long as you could gain one void merit through any of these processes, you could be considered to have reached the mark. The combat merits were harder as you needed to accumulate 10 million void points, 10 void merits, and you also needed to complete at least one galaxy-ranked mission as well. As for the second requirement, it didn't need an explanation. "I'm not quite ready yet." Lionel grinned. Why should he be in a rush? There were benefits to being low-ranked as well, even if they weren't as excellent as being unranked. Plus, he hadn't quite met all the requirements yet. He was still in Tier 6 of the 5th dimension, and he was still a bit away from earning a civilian merit. That said, Lionel wasn't very worried about his tier. With the increase to his comprehension of his Scarlet Star Force, he could break through to the quasi-6th dimension and form his final star whenever he wanted, just like how he had relied on it previously. The only reason he hadn't was because, first, he had been focused on other things, and secondly, he had still yet to fully grasp the visualization of. All this time, he had been relying on his innate know to break the shackles of his mind and not as he was meant to. If he didn't comprehend it first, it would be more difficult to do so later and he wouldn't be able to pass down the pieces of to his friends and brothers like he wanted to. With Lionel's current strength of mind, though, he didn't believe that this would be any sort of big trouble to him at all. Following that, he would still have to learn about the God Path as well. All in all, Lionel wasn't in a rush. He couldn't leave the Void Palace anyway, and there was nothing pressing for his time outside of the coming air wars. He could afford to lay his foundation more stably. Dimitri shook his head and handed the permit over. Try not to destroy too much. And this time, please don't hang naked bodies outside of my branch again. At the very least, not half-castrated bodies. Lionel laughed, but Dimitri couldn't help but notice that he didn't make any promises. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch and made a straight line toward their next destination. It was clear that they already had in mind exactly what they wanted, there wasn't any slight hesitation in their steps. Soon, they stopped in front of a building. This plot of land would cost 40 million, at least double the price of the cheapest near Senate locations. However, Lionel still chose it not because of its nicer locale, but rather because of who owned it. Without a word, Lionel pressed his fore and middle finger together, his fingers piercing forward in a swift slash. Those that had smelt trouble had already backed away, beginning to spectate from a safe distance. However, even they were shocked when they saw the green thread banner and signboard being split in two. The sign rattled to the ground beneath the deafening silence. Just because they were licking their wounds, didn't mean that Lionel had to let them. Chapter 1495. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1495. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, that's it? Aina asked. Just the sign? Lionel chuckled. There's a perfectly good building right here. If we destroy it, wouldn't we have to build a new one? Well, just have to thank Triana in advance. Aina shook her head. Sometimes she couldn't decide whether Lionel was charismatic, or the exact opposite. What kind of charismatic person was so good at pissing people off? She didn't even have any good emotions toward Triana, but she suddenly felt bad for her. By this point, Lionel had crippled so many of Triana's people that Aina wouldn't be surprised if most were too afraid to even help the Green Thread faction any longer. Then, he stripped 3 of her more powerful faction guardians naked and posted them up for everyone to see. And now, as though all of that wasn't enough, Lionel actually wanted to just snatch away one of their buildings? Although Aina had only been in one of Triana's hospitals, it was enough to know that their faction had spent quite a lot on aesthetics, and was especially particular about using materials that could keep anarchic force out. There was no doubt that the building itself was worth just as much as the ground it was built on, if not more. Aina had thought that Lionel would destroy it entirely, but who knew that he would actually be shameless enough to speak of just keeping it? I didn't know you could be so shameless. I'm still holding back, Lionel said proudly, as though he had been complimented. If I were to really go all out, would be on baby 3 by now. Aina didn't know what to say. How'd he manage to make this about baby making again? Did he not have anything else on his mind? They were about to enter a battle. As though Aina's thoughts were some kind of cue, the doors of the treatment center burst open, 3 individuals charging out at once. It was clear that the commotion of their sign being split in 2 and falling to the ground wasn't small, even alerting so many. When they saw that it was Lionel and Aina across from them, their expressions changed. By now, who of the Green Thread faction wouldn't have heard of these 2? Lionel didn't wait, holding up the permit he had just purchased. "I'll be challenging your storefront today." His words were simple and didn't carry the same smiling expression he had had for Aina at all. However, they alone were enough for the accumulating crowd to react as though a bucket of water had been thrown into hot oil. The expression of the green-haired young man leading the group changed before becoming nasty. Why was it that lots of land near Senate branches were so valuable? One of the reasons was the safety inherent to the region. Fighting within a Senate branch was prohibited, and most subconsciously stretched out that range to the general vicinity of the branch as well. However, Lionel was clearly not a person with such qualms. It was clear Lionel believed that their faction was one he could just casually bully whenever he wanted. Many had already acknowledged his strength, and it was fair enough that it could be said that their faction had started things, but did he think that he could be so casual with challenging them? Lionel had spent a year in seclusion, and he had only just entered the Void Palace, so how could he know about the trials and tribulations their faction had already undergone? The Vierer family was nowhere near as strong as the Morales family, to begin with, nor could it compare to the Constellation families, or those other noble families that ran big-shot organizations like Shield Cross Stars or the Force Crafters Guild. And yet, despite not having such a background, they had managed to carve out a monopoly for themselves on the backs of not just their hard work, but the talent of their future matriarch, Triana. As badly as Lionel and Aina thought they had been bullied by their faction, when they had just started off, they had faced far worse. So, from their point of view, Lionel and Aina were overestimating themselves. At least back then, Triana still had the backing of her faction. But right here, there were only these 2. Did they think that they were enough? The young man stormed forward, a heavy black chain appearing in his hands. Without waiting for another word, he flicked his wrists, causing it surge forward like a tide. The shadows of the chain seemed to block all lanes of retreat. The attack was swift and powerful, but flexible and subtle at the same time. Lionel had rarely fought chain and whip experts in the past, but there was no doubt that this young man was the most skilled he had ever seen. His hands shook, and one of his fingers flexed as spear force accumulated. He was just about to pierce forward when Aina grabbed his wrist. "I let you have all the fun last time because you were angry, but this time it's my fault. Do you think you're the only one with a temper?" Aina glared at Lionel before ignoring him entirely and sending out a punch. In that moment, what sounded like a clap of thunder shattered the snaking shadows, revealing the image of the main whip, only for it to collide with Aina's fist. Compared to the heft of the chain, Aina's slender arm and small fist really looked too frail. And yet, it was exactly this frail punch that stopped the chain in its place, sending a surge of energy through its body and causing the wrist of the young man controlling it to break. A shriek of horror sounded, but Aina had already vanished from her spot, her foot lightly tapping the ground as a rush of crimson fog enveloped her. Lionel seemed to realize at that moment that Aina hadn't just improved a little bit, she was now in the quasi-6th dimension, and her strength showed it. Chapter 1496. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1496. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The 3 that had come fell one after another, unable to last even a few exchanges with Aina. They writhed on the ground, their bodies aching with pain. Back then, Aina had only allowed Lionel to fight on her behalf because she quite liked the feeling of him protecting her. So long as it wasn't a life or death situation, he didn't mind being a docile partner to his right. However, as much as she liked that, she also liked fighting, and she could sense a powerful opponent inside. If she didn't claim this battle for herself and let Lionel attack first, she wouldn't even get the chance to regret it later. When Lionel started fighting, he forgot about everything else. Sometimes he looked like even more of a battle maniac than she was. The three youths that had fallen to the ground were unable to get up. Aina's fighting style didn't seem as wild or murderous as Lionel's, but only they knew well that Aina was maybe even more vicious. Lionel might rip out an arm, but Aina's offensive seemed to make sure that they'd have broken bones and leaking inner organs in the worst of places. They couldn't even breathe without feeling as though shards of glass were lodged in their lungs. At that moment, the very figure Aina had been waiting for walked out. The young lady was wrapped in what looked like green leather armor that clung tightly to her curves. Vines, flowers, and even the occasional patch of bark decorated her armor, making it difficult to tell if it was real leather at all, or if it was just a special sort of plant. Lionel knew who this young woman was quite immediately. Of course, this wasn't by her name or her feats, but rather the role she played. The thoughts of the three youths that had charged out initially were not wrong. The Green Thread faction had, indeed, gone through a lot to reach its current level. As such, they had many policies in place to protect themselves, policies that Lionel was mostly familiar with due to his buying of information. Every one of Triana's properties was protected by a powerhouse. These powerhouses were the core of the Vierer family's strength in this generation. Triana might have been the best, but she had others of her age chase after her footsteps, some more powerful than others. One of these so-called powerhouses was Rosamund, whom Lionel had had a run-in with. This lady here was clearly another one. She was only in Tier 3 of the 6th dimension, but despite this, her presence made Emily, Elliot, and Jova, who had all been in Tier 4, seem like small tides on a slow day. It was clear that in the Void Palace, Tier was the very last measurement you should use to gauge someone's strength. Underestimating someone because their tier was low could very well cause you to suffer greatly. There was no doubt that this woman was either very close or already within the 97th percentile, having taken around 5 years or less to rise from nominal disciple to galaxy-ranked disciple. Seeing the state of her three family members, the young woman frowned before her gaze locked onto Aina. The two women moved at once. The young woman in green leather and bits and pieces of nature flipped a palm to reveal an emerald green whip. At the same time, Aina's spatial ring trembled, revealing a long, snaking silk scarf that curled above her arms, following them up her shoulder and around the back of her neck. Aina looked like she had just worn a shawl, but it was clear at a glance that it didn't touch her. Whip and cloth shot out, however, when they met. Instead of hearing the sounds of a cracking whip, there was only a gentle and reserved thud. The two women floated about with an eye-aching speed, their two styles seemingly completely different. The young woman's whip was fast, harsh and straight to the point. But Aina's silk cloth seemed to flow softly and slowly, redirecting all the strength it faced without the slightest hurry. This seemed to paint the illusion that Aina was having a simple time, but Lionel's gaze remained narrowed. Their fighting styles were different, but they were still about equal. Of course, the young woman had yet to use her god runes, and as for Aina, since when was this her usual style? She was trying to learn something completely separate from her usual, and she was clearly using this young woman as a whetstone. Alright, you two just keep fighting then. I'll be inside. Lionel casually waved a hand and walked through the battlefield. As for worrying about Aina, he didn't feel like he needed to. If the young woman didn't have an upper hand now, she would never get one. The young woman tried to stop Lionel but quickly found that she couldn't escape Aina even if she tried. It was only then that she, who had thought that she was still holding back and could still easily manage the situation, suddenly realized that this was very, very, very far from the truth. Like this, an odd scene played out. Aina and the young woman were locked in a clash, but every so often, another body would fly out from the store. If this person was lucky, they would be flung out of a door. If they were unlucky, they'd be flung out a window. The pile of Green Thread faction members continued to grow. Without a choice, the young woman could only roar, releasing her god runes and hoping to end her battle with Aina quickly, but who could have thought that Aina's body would suddenly bloom, delicate black tattoos stretching across her skin and forcing the young woman into yet another deadlock. No. It wasn't a deadlock. The injuries seemed to accumulate rapidly on the young woman's body. Her anxiousness played against her strengths. She didn't even realize that the moment Aina had drawn first blood, the battle was already over. But this was something she would learn very soon as Aina extracted what benefits she could from her and added her to the pile. Chapter 1497. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1497. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel patted his hands and opened the double glass doors to the treatment center from the inside, grinning at Aina. Right this moment, she had a slight sheen of sweat on her body, but it only seemed to make her more attractive. Aina hadn't worn makeup ever since the metamorphosis descended, but she only seemed to get more perfect as the days went on. Even in this state, she looked too good. If it wasn't for Lionel's status, who knew how much trouble her beauty would have brought them? Fighting Lionel was one thing, but stealing his woman was a completely different matter. Things related to marriage and future betrothals were all mostly decided by families. Considering who Lionel's parents were, even if he didn't become the heir apparent of the Morales family, there were very few who would dare to interfere in this. Even when it came to Elliot speaking of stripping Aina naked, this was more of a scare tactic than anything else. Doing something like humiliating Lionel's future wife was in line with castrating an individual. It was truly that important. For the same reason castration was taboo, crossing the line in this fashion wasn't something many would do. Only those who didn't care to give face to the Morales family would ever dare to do anything to Aina. Or, more accurately, dare to take things too far with Aina. It could be said that Lionel had most definitely benefited from his status again. Or else a woman like Aina, who was definitely soon to enter the Queen Beauty rankings, wasn't one most would idly sit by and watch a rookie like Lionel woo her without challenge. Lionel beamed a smile at Aina and stepped aside to let her in. "Welcome to your palace, my queen. It's a bit shabby, but make do with it for now. I'll find you a better one very soon." Aina laughed and shook her head, but the Green Thread faction members, still trying to pick themselves up outside, nearly vomited up more mouthfuls of blood, this time from rage rather than their injuries. Shabby? Not even counting the wealth of force herbs and other medicines they stored inside for the treatment of their patients, just the materials, architecture, and building itself cost almost 50 million void points. This wasn't an amount most galaxy-ranked disciples could even make without several decades of effort. But, even daring to spend it all in one sitting was another matter altogether. Too few would even dare to stomach such a thing. However, the couple didn't even seem to hear their grievances as they closed the doors, and entering the spacious lobby. "So what do we do now?" Aina asked. She had left all the planning to Lionel, and this man really couldn't be bothered to explain things ahead of time. By now, she had just learned to compromise and take certain things as they came. "Well, first, there are still patients here. We'll need to treat them first. They'll be our vanguard as well as our advertisement." Aina rose an eyebrow before nodding in understanding. "We'll have trouble beyond that, though," she responded. "Even if word of mouth spreads that our service is good, not many would dare to come here, to begin with. I'm almost certain that their faction will take a page out of your book." Aina gave Lionel a look, but he only laughed at this. Of course, Lionel had thought of this as well. What was the strongest weapon of a large faction? It was obviously intimidation. One might be scared of Lionel, but he was still a single person. There were only so many places he could be at once. But, the Green Thread faction practically controlled all the medicine at the nominal, quadrant and galaxy ranked, having done away with all their competition. Even if others feared Lionel, he couldn't possibly deal with everyone who needed treatment from Triana's medical centers, right? Plus, Lionel didn't have the heart to do such a thing anyway. One reason he didn't destroy this building was that it was more useful intact, but the other reason was that he didn't want to harm the people who weren't related to this matter at all. There are a few ways I've thought to handle this. But the first and most important right now is anonymity. I chose a location nearby a Senate branch not because of safety. It wouldn't be safe here anyway after we offended them, and not for traffic either. After all, by the time we're done, people will be flocking. I chose it because there'll be plausible deniability. Once I'm done, it'll be impossible to tell if someone came here to visit the Senate branch, or if they came to be treated. By the end, the flow-in will be so great that it'll no longer matter. So let's deal with these patients first, then we can go to the next step where you'll have to take center stage. There also happens to be someone here who should be somewhat useful to us. Aina raised a brow but didn't say much. The process was quick. The number of patients numbered in the high dozens, but the combination of Lionel's and Aina's abilities, not to mention the latter's expertise, and it felt like they were blessed by some sort of god. Under usual circumstances, patients would probably be reluctant to be treated by someone they didn't know, but disciples of the Void Palace didn't usually have such luxury. And, because the commotion didn't reach them, many had no idea that the two weren't even part of the Green Thread faction until they were discharged. What astonished those outside was that many who had entered half-dead began to come out mere minutes later in the best condition of their lives, only to be shocked to learn from the growing crowd that it wasn't the Green Thread faction that had treated them at all. Alright, they'll focus on building the formation to protect this place. Aina nodded. Then they'll go to the Force Pill faction. Knock their socks off, Lionel said with a laugh. Who says that anymore? You're getting old. Lionel could only watch Aina's hips sway off into the distance. In the end, he smiled and focused on his task. Very soon, his girlfriend would be sending the Void Palace into another shock, so how could he fall far behind? Chapter 1498. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1498. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As Lionel worked, news began to quickly spread back to the Green Thread faction and beyond. It was quite rare for challenges like this to happen between factions, let alone for two individuals without a faction at all to suddenly rush up to challenge a faction on their own like this. It only made it a hotter topic when it was considered that the Green Thread faction had just been promoted to the silver grade. Lionel, though, had focused so much on the task at hand that nothing else seemed to matter to him at all. However, what no one could have expected that on this day, the situation would completely change. Boom. 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 Even if he didn't want to, at this point, Lionel had no choice but to snap awake, the sudden backlash of the incomplete force art nearly throwing him into the air. Lionel coughed violently, his expression warping. The ground shook and quaked, the earth that looked so sturdy and impenetrable before splitting in several regions. What the hell? Lionel grabbed out towards something to stabilize himself, his gaze turning cold as he ran through possibilities. His head turned up, looking in the direction that Aina had left, but he suddenly realized that it had already been half a day since then. He had been so focused that he didn't notice the time passing. This much wasn't unexpected, Lionel was already prepared for her to be gone for a while. According to their original plan, Aina would get certified by the Force Pill faction. Lionel had faith that Aina would perform astoundingly. Once she did, her name would spread for a reason other than her combat prowess, and then their next steps would flow much more smoothly. According to Lionel's estimations, it would probably take Aina about this long to succeed. But, before she could return, something seemed to have happened to the Violet Palace. Before Lionel could think any further, the coldness in his eyes vanished, and a portal the size of which he couldn't even fathom appeared. The Void Palace itself was already larger than any construct Lionel had ever seen. Its mountains and moons loomed in the vastness of space, stretching out for dozens of planets' widths and heights. Yet, this portal appeared to dwarf it in size. No matter where you were, whether at the bottom of the mountain or the top, and whether you were still in the fifth dimension or the well into the seventh, there was not a single soul present that didn't feel as though their souls were being sucked out of their bodies. Is that a zone? Lionel couldn't breathe. It didn't make any sense. The zones of the Void Palace should have long since been cleared. The only ones that remained open for missions were unique zones kept open so that their resources could be benefited from. It didn't make any sense for a new zone to suddenly appear like this one. And why was it so large? Lionel could barely tilt his head into the skies to find a flood of powerful auras rushing into the skies, each one of them wearing a serious expression. It was hard to tell if they understood what was going on, or if they were just as confused as everyone else was. But, at that moment, nothing seemed to matter at all. Unable to do anything to stop it, the Void Palace and all of its students, teachers, and volunteers were swallowed whole. In a distant location, Velasco's head snapped upward, his expression changing. If Lionel had been here to see his father, his own heart would have skipped several beats. This was something that he had never seen before. Soon, Velasco's shocked expression turned from surprise to unbridled fury, his glasses cracking and shattering beneath the pressure. Bits and shards threatened to blind him, and yet he didn't even blink a single time. A craft that had been formed of seventh-dimensional materials shattered and attacked the most vulnerable location on his body, and yet they rebounded off of his irises as though meeting a steel wall. From beginning to end, the usual prankster of a father didn't even flinch. Velasco's fury shattered the bounds of reality, the planet he was standing above going from whole to pierced through in the blink of an eye. It was as though a massive rod had run from its north pole to the south pole, its core being obliterated. Just like that, an eighth-dimensional planet was torn to shreds, its implosion cascading into the surroundings like a supernova's eruption. Velasco didn't say anything for a long while, simply staring into the distance. However, his expression became calmer and calmer until the point it seemed as though nothing had happened at all, until he erupted into boisterous laughter. The sonic waves that billowed out from his lungs formed concentric circles in the depths of space, the waves cracking and shattering space. It seemed no different from a normal laugh on the surface. In fact, it even sounded jovial. But anyone who knew Velasco was quite aware that he was absolutely enraged. Thoroughly enraged. The last people who had heard this laughter were those of the Void Palace almost 30 years ago, and now it had appeared once more. Why was he here in the first place? Why was he trudging and slaughtering his way through a different domain instead of staying by his wife's side and wasting the hours away teasing that useless son of his? It was precisely so that he could make sure that this exact thing didn't happen. And yet, they had actually dared to test his bottom line like this. It seemed that since he had disappeared for so many years so that he could raise his son, they had forgotten just who Velasco Morales was. He would make them pay dearly. And if a single hair was harmed on his wife's head, he would show them something worse than hell. As for his son, well, he could always make another one. Chapter 1499. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1499. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel snapped awake, his body shooting upward as his nerves were primed to an extreme. His mind ran on overdrive, scanning everything around him. But he ultimately found nothing. He was in the depths of a forest, but it was oddly green. He hadn't seen such greenery in over years since he had been stuck in the Void Palace. But this didn't put him at ease at all. Hadn't the whole Void Palace been swallowed? So how was it that he was no longer where he had been previously? How long had he been out of it? Did someone bring him here? No, that didn't make sense. Why would someone just plop him in the middle of a forest and then run away? He could sense anything in his near vicinity. Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. Then, he leaped into the tree by his side before plummeting back down once again. His eyes widened. This world? Just where was he? He had gotten used to the pinnacle's seventh-dimensional atmosphere of the Void Palace, and he had jumped accordingly. But he actually hadn't jumped as high as he thought he should have. It couldn't be. Was this an eighth-dimensional world? That didn't make sense either. The combination of dense anarchic force and its pinnacle's seventh-dimensional atmosphere should have made the Void Palace no less difficult to navigate than any eighth-dimensional world. In fact, there were definitely eighth-dimensional worlds that couldn't compare to the Void Palace in this regard. However, the suppression Lionel felt on his body and his ability index was just as great if not greater. Lionel didn't even want to think about what this meant. Just what the hell kind of zone was this? That was when something in Lionel's mind suddenly clicked, a spark of lightning going off in his dreamscape. When the realization sunk in, he felt his heart tremble. He only had one thought: was this the end of the human race? Lionel took a breath and his expression went entirely cold. The pressure he suddenly felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. With all this talk of zones, unique zones, controlling them, and manipulating them, Lionel had a thought that he never put into action. What if you used zones as weapons of mass destruction? What if you suddenly trapped all the greatest geniuses of a race in a single zone? As for the entry limit? Who cared? In fact, wouldn't it be better to go over that count? Lionel had experienced it before personally. Back when he entered the Camelot zone, the members of the Slayer Legion and the Aderna family had died after being turned into Walking Dead puppets. However, after Lionel released them, the zone once again registered them as living beings. And, because Lionel had taken Little Blackstar out of the snow globe for the first time back then, the zone had registered one additional person. The penalty for one additional person hadn't been too harsh. But, their time limit had still been restricted. But, what if you went over 2 people? 10? 100? Several thousand? Millions? There were easily millions of youths in the Void Palace, and that was just the young. What about the older individuals? What if this zone also counted the cursed beasts in the mountains just like they had counted Little Blackstar back then? By then, the penalty would be so harsh that they might all be finished. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they had already surpassed the time limit. But, he couldn't even check because he no longer had the dictionary by his side. It was a masterstroke, indeed. Whoever did this needed the ability to take control of a zone, change its location, and Lionel was certain that they would also have to be able to manipulate the size of the zone as well. After all, if the zone was too small, how would it swallow them all up like this? Lionel's expression only became colder the longer he thought. This wasn't just vicious, it was as good as committing genocide on an impossibly large scale. Everyone who had been sucked into this zone would never be able to return. Lionel took a breath and his heart finally slowed to a crawl. He couldn't help but internally sneer, his mind reaching an unprecedented level of focus. He definitely couldn't say that he was bored any longer. It seemed it was time for him to find out if this was the challenge he would be unable to overcome, or if even this wasn't enough. At that moment, the rustling of leaves entered Lionel's ears. He didn't seem surprised by this at all. The moment he had failed to jump into the tree, he had already felt that something like this would happen. The commotion he had caused was not small. Right then, a group of a half-dozen appeared. But, when Lionel saw their appearances, his eyes couldn't help but narrow. It wasn't that he recognized them, or that he was surprised that he didn't recognize them. Rather, it was that he was just not expecting such a thing. The group that surrounded him wore clothing right out of the Stone Ages. The women wore beast skins to cover their chests and bottoms, while the men just wore the latter. All of them wielded wooden spears and stared toward Lionel with a menacing light in their eyes. Without hesitation, they all pierced forward at once, but Lionel didn't even more. Just when it seemed that they would all skewer him through, the points of their spears shattered into a rain of ash, leaving them watching in shock as their weapons crumbled to the ground. Despite the fact that their weapons seemed simple, any weapon carved from a world of this caliber would be strong. They were used to hunting beasts tens of times Lionel's side without fear, but they suddenly felt their hearts constrict. They roared out, barking in a language Lionel couldn't even begin to understand. But, even as 2 of them seemed intent on continuing, another fell to their knees, followed by a second, and then a third. Chapter 1500. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1500. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze sharpened, striking out with 2 palms, one right before him and the other to his left. While some have fallen to their knees, another contingent had chosen to attack directly instead. It was clear that these individuals weren't of one mind, and he still couldn't understand what language they were speaking. All he knew was that they seemed to be thoroughly enraged by his mere existence. A jolt of pain shot through Lionel's arms, causing his pupils to constrict. These people, he was sure that they weren't at his level. How were they so strong? Lionel's hips pivoted, his approach changing in the blink of an eye. From a direct approach, his movements became like flowing water, diverting the strength of the 2 that had attacked him off to his sides. His weight shifted, his elbow driving down toward the head of one as they lost their balance and stumbled forward. A sickening crack resounded, but the jolt that traveled up Lionel's arm caused his body to shiver, resulting in him almost missing the timing to attack the second individual. He instigated Dream's sense into action, splitting the sensation the millions of ways and dulling to the point his Bodhi's initial reaction whittled down to nearly nothing. Taking advantage of his recovery and his shift of momentum to a single leg, he lifted his other foot, ramming his shin into the nose of the second stumbling warrior. A spurt of blood followed another sickening crack. Just as quickly, they both crumbled to the ground, causing those that had chosen to kneel to cower even more. To them, Lionel's movements were beyond their understanding, but only Lionel himself knew just how much pressure he had been under just now. The strength of these people was no less than his own, it was just that his own technique was far more refined than their own and his ability to adapt and react was far beyond even their imaginations. All things being equal, Lionel would have lost if the two of them ganged up on him. And, even if he could fight them one-on-one, he would very quickly find himself in an all-out brawl. It would have been difficult to tell just who would win or lose. Luckily, just then, Lionel had shifted from his more direct style and implemented concepts of gentle into his movements. If not, he had been very close to suffering just now. Even if his bones didn't fracture, his shoulders might have dislocated. It was hard for Lionel to accept this because he didn't feel the pressure of the sixth dimension from these people. But, from what he knew of the dimensional verse, unless you were an astounding genius of the other races, there was no way someone in the fifth dimension could have put him in such a state. Of those he had met, maybe only Amory, Aina and Miguel could match Lionel while still being in the fifth dimension. And that was just raw strength. Truthfully, Lionel didn't think he could possibly lose to some at the same strength. Part of the reason was likely because of the arrogance Aina had spoken about him having, but another part was justified. When Lionel had said he could beat Aina 10 out of 10 times and then gotten beaten up by her moments later, his thoughts had never really changed. If it came down to a matter of life and death where he could go all out, and he actually had intentions of winning, he felt that someone would have to be in the seventh dimension, at least, to make him truly despair. Lionel's greatest trump card, his mind, was something that most simply couldn't counter. Still, while he had easily defeated these few individuals, their strength astonished him. They were probably in the fifth dimension. But they actually had such strength? No, I can't tell what dimension they are at all. I have no idea, Lionel's brows furrowed. He had never had an issue with telling someone's dimension so long as they were close to his own or beneath him. Even for those far above, it wasn't too difficult to guess by process of elimination. But this, and this language. Aren't they human? Why can't I understand it? This was another thing that baffled Lionel. By now, he didn't even need to use language translation treasures anymore because picking up a new language for him had become far easier, especially since the highest echelons of the human domain all pretty much spoke the same language. Even when the language was a little different from what he was used to, his mind had become fast enough to pick up on the quirks quickly and adjust. He had done something similar on planet Luxnix. However, this language was so far and away different that he hadn't grasped it even after hearing the speak it for so long. Lionel's frown deepened. Without the segmented cube's inner space to rely on, he didn't have a convenient device to take out right now. I need to retreat. These people are already so powerful and nothing about them screams leadership, or else they wouldn't have been so divided in how to react to me. I'll need to find time to scout them and comprehend their language first, then we can consider a next step. With Lionel's thinking speed, the two he had defeated had hard fallen to the ground by the time he came to a decision. A strong light force swirled around him and his three illusory tails appeared once more. With a step, he leapt into the trees he could reach before, vanishing into their folds. He didn't miss the gasp and shock of these people when they saw his use of force. But, he could only note this and disappear. He wrapped himself in a thin layer of ethereal star force and hid in the trees, observing the group and planning on following them. Not long later, he was proven to be correct as a burly man who seemed very much like their leader appeared. Chapter 1501. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1501. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The group quickly began to explain what had happened to their leader as Lionel watched. He passively absorbed what they were saying, filling in context clues and trying to piece together their language. For Lionel, this wasn't very difficult. It would take others a year or two of observing a language to reach a passable level, but Lionel would only take a few hours at worst so long as these people spoke enough. However, while he listened, his gaze couldn't help but focus on the burly man. The pressure he gave off was far beyond that of the others. Lionel felt that he was right to leave when he had. This man. Lionel really wasn't sure if he could defeat him. What was once again the most astonishing about this was the fact that Lionel couldn't tell the burly man's dimension either. But now, he began to understand why it was. The more he observed, the more possibilities he thought of until he eventually landed on one. Back when Lionel was in the third dimension, he had broken through with his body and his mind first. In the former case, he entered the fourth dimension first, and in the later, it was even more exaggerated as he entered the fifth dimension long before stepping foot outside of the third dimension. Now, he was in a similar situation, with his mind actually being in the seventh dimension currently. However, regardless of the situation, everyone had always seen him as a third-dimensional existence back then, and right now, everyone only saw him as a fifth-dimensional existence. Why was that? Lionel had never really thought about it before, but now it seemed too obvious. Your dimensions seemed to be decided by the force level you could wield and control with your nodes. It probably wasn't so simple, but in all the fourth-dimensional books Lionel had read in the Void Library, this seemed to be the most appropriate conclusion. In that case, wasn't the reason Lionel couldn't tell the dimension of these people because they couldn't use force as he could? If they could, why would they be so shocked by his use of force just now? At that moment, the head of the burly man suddenly snapped in Lionel's direction. The sudden change was enough to make anyone's heart leap out of their chest. But, who was Lionel? He was a man whose mind worked at a speed that could put even a computer to shame. Let alone catching him off guard with the turn of a head, Lionel had already seen through the burly man's movements long before he made them and stood absolutely still, not moving an inch. Lionel wasn't a short distance away. With the sensory boost his starry-tailed fox gave him, he was able to listen in and observe this group from just over half a kilometer away. Even if he could see the burly man's face as bright as day, didn't mean the latter could do the same. Though it was surprising that the man was so sensitive, that was all. As expected, after furrowing his brows, the burly man turned back, continuing to listen to the reports. However, Lionel didn't relax. Such a powerful person definitely trusted in their instincts to a great degree. Even if he didn't find evidence of Lionel, he would proceed with caution as though there really was someone there. Plus, considering his people were likely currently informing him about Lionel's appearance right this moment, he had even more reason to be cautious. Minutes later, the burly man waved a hand and the explanation stopped. Well, by that point, it had fallen into a near all-out brawl between the two sides as those that had kneeled versus those that had fought clashed. By this point, Lionel understood some of their speech. Those that kneeled kept using a word that sounded like ladle to refer to him while the people that had fought kept using a word that sounded like seiko. It was clear that one had a positive connotation while the other had a negative one. Lionel just couldn't quite understand if the latter group's animosity was rooted in something much deeper, or if they were just made he had so easily defeated them. Soon, the group began to make their way to their destination. It wasn't long before Lionel learned that the reason they had separated in the first place was that their leader was scouting out the situation ahead and laying out their plan of approach. What Lionel didn't expect, though, was to follow this group for 3 days as they found and hunted down a single beast the size of a small van. By that point, his throat was parched, and he had to use dream sense to stop his stomach from rumbling. Despite there not being any anarchic force in the air, this world made Lionel feel like he was once again a third-dimensional being. The only good news was that the group stopped to rest so that Lionel could sleep and that by this point, he had already grasped their language entirely. It took longer than expected because they rarely spoke during their hunt, focusing on remaining quiet and stealthy. But, Lionel's patience had finally paid off. Well, return home now, the burly man said, looking off into the distance again. Lionel had made it a point not to antagonize the man during these days, keeping his eyes off of him. The man only seemed to have a sixth sense for Lionel's gaze, but not his presence. This meant that so long as Lionel didn't look at him directly for too long, he would slowly relax. It took another day before the group of 7 finally returned to their home, and by this point, Lionel felt like a walking skeleton. The good news was that he had managed to take advantage of some rivers they had passed by to deal with his thirst. He was able to take advantage of the water force concentration to deal with it. But food remained elusive. Every time they came across an animal, it would either run away or their hunting group would add it to their haul. Finally, Lionel could confirm their location before going off and dealing with his needs. The moment Lionel spotted the small village, he was ready to turn back and leave. But what he didn't expect was for an older gentleman to walk out to greet the group. Before Lionel could turn away and leave, yet another head snapped in his direction. It was the older man. Anne. Lionel was certain that unlike the failure of the burly man, he had been spotted this time. Chapter 1502. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1502. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dove out of the way, a hair-raising feeling of danger drilling into his mind as the primitive man's instincts roared at him for the first time in a long while. Without hesitation, Lionel rolled out of the tree, his palm flipping over to reveal his self-made bow. Even as he fell from the tree, his gaze grew cold. He pulled the bowstring taut, his vision finding the one line of sight through the thickness of the trees. At that moment, the location he had just been sitting in suddenly imploded. It looked as though someone had planted a bomb into the core of the tree, only to trigger it right this instant. However, Lionel knew better. This was definitely related to the attention of the old man. Lionel took a breath, releasing his arrow and a breath all at once. Swift. The arrow shot through the air as though on rocket fuel. The sound of whistling wind didn't even reach Lionel's ears until Lit had already appeared before the old man's brows. No one even registered the beautiful curve the attack took through the trees. In fact, Lionel, who had begun falling from the tree, had still not even hit the ground yet. If one thought that the only weapon force that Lionel had strengthened during the last year was his spear force, you would be sorely mistaken. Even if the application wasn't the same, with Lionel's feel for the bow, his ability to translate his findings felt almost as natural as breathing. His talent in the bow seemed to be on a level all to its own. The old man was caught off guard. However, his vision alone seemed to carry some explosive strength all to itself. The moment he locked onto the arrow, even if it was in the final moment, it too imploded. However, the arrow had gotten so close to him that the explosion obstructed his vision, allowing Lionel to vanish from his sight. One would have thought that Lionel would take the opportunity to run, but almost as soon as he took the advantage, Lionel pressed Dream Class. Sniper Archer. Lionel fired 3 more arrows before he even touched the ground, his bow force blazing with life and vitality. Each seemed to carry with it its own flair, reaching a level of freedom and unrestrained power that even Lionel's spear seemed to lack. But it was only right that things were like this. Lionel's bow force was being forcefully restrained to the 5th dimension from the 6th, while his spear force had yet to take that step. To an outside observer, though, this would still be a shock. One was supported by spear domain while the other was not. This should have closed the gap. And yet, Lionel's bow force seemed to have still left his spear force in the dust. The 3 arrows appeared within the ground in the blink of an eye, all 3 fluttering like soaring birds and curving toward the burly man. Lionel landed on the ground, his gaze sharp as he brandished another arrow. These 3 days he hadn't just been casually wasting time. Whenever he found a suitable branch, he would snap it off and form another arrow. In this time, he had already formed hundreds for a situation just like this one. The burly man, whose first instinct was to protect the old man even though the latter didn't need it, couldn't believe that he was actually the target. He reacted quickly, brandishing his spear toward the first coming arrow, feeling that the 2 trailing behind it were less of a threat. But, to his horror, the moment he pierced out with a strike he had practiced no less than 10,000 times, he actually missed. The arrow fluttered, slowing down a measure. In the grand scheme, it was akin to a car racing down the highway easing up from 100 kilometers an hour to 95, but in a battle this high level, such a sudden and abrupt change was enough to change everything. Thwack! The arrow pierced into the burly man's collarbone, throwing off his ability to be able to deal with the remaining 2 arrows. One pierced into his knee, ruining his mobility. The other tore into the soft side of his elbow, removing his ability to brandish his spear with both hands. Lionel, though, was still shocked by the outcome. Those arrows should have gone through the burly man's body entirely. And yet, it had sounded like he just stuck them into a solid tree. Just how strong was this person's body? Even Lionel, who had the Morales family's metal body technique, wasn't so sturdy, at least not without releasing both his divine armor and bronze runes, and even then he wouldn't be able to match up. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't get to linger on the thought for long, because he knew the vision of the old man would clear right this moment. He was already prepared, releasing the string of his arrow again. But, just as he was about to, his fingers paused. He could see it quite clearly. The old man was incredibly pale-faced, hints of blood falling down his cheeks like streaking tears. Lionel knew right then that even if the old man wanted to act again, he wouldn't be able to. Still, he kept his senses primed, walking forward slowly. He had taken advantage of the situation to deal with the burly man, so this was a chance he shouldn't give him. He wasn't sure if this small village had anyone else so powerful, but his deductions told him that the answer to that question was no. If there were, it was unlikely for someone with the status the old man seemed to have to come out to greet them personally. If Lionel was correct, then all of this village's strongest existences were right here. At that moment, the small group watched in horror as Lionel slowly walked out of the forest's edge, his bow still raised. If he was so effective from 500 meters away, none of them dared to imagine just what kind of monster he would be at this close a range. There was no way any of them could deal with such a thing. Chapter 1503. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1503. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The old man breathed heavily, a concentrated look in his eyes. He seemed to be trying very hard to recover so that he could attack again. But, something about the coldness in Lionel's eyes seemed to tell him that he would be prepared for this. In fact, he seemed to feel that Lionel was untouchable. The burly man roared. Limping on one leg, he dove at Lionel, brandishing his spear with one arm. But, just as he was about to skewer Lionel through, his spear burst into a rain of ash. Losing his spear and without hitting the target he thought he would, the burly man fell forward, hitting the ground cheek first and skidding to a stop at Lionel's feet. When the old man saw this, his eyes opened as wide as saucers. Under the astonished gazes of the hunter squadron and the few who had come out of the village after hearing the commotion, the old man fell to his knees. Esteemed nobleman, please forgive my ignorance. He kowtowed as hard as he could, his forehead smashing into the ground repeatedly. Despite the fact that this location was mostly soft soil, the old man was so vehement that his forehead eventually split into a bloody wound. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Was this reaction because of his spear domain? Or was it something else? If Lionel didn't know better, he would think that he had somehow stumbled into the tribulation of his spear domain heirloom. He had found it very weird these past few days that he hadn't run into anyone from the Void Palace. Usually, when one entered a sub-dimensional zone, you were all taken to the very same place. When Lionel and Aina entered the Paris zone, they appeared in a village together. When Lionel entered the Camelot zone with the Slayer Legion, the only reason he had been able to go off on his own was that he entered first and then used his self-created craft to hide underground when the others appeared. Regardless of the situation, everyone who entered together always appeared together. It simply didn't make any sense that Lionel was on his own like this. So, he had assumed that something else went wrong. Maybe his spear domain heirloom was triggered again, moving his tribulation up even further. It felt possible since everyone he ran into seemed to use a spear as well. But, Lionel wasn't willing to conclude this. For one, the spear was an innately common weapon to begin with, especially in a more primitive setting like this one. People like to call the sword the first weapon, but the truth was that the first weapon, if not the rock, was most definitely the spear. Plus, there was also the matter of the sheer number of individuals that had entered. Lionel couldn't ignore the fact that the basic functions of this zone had been ruined by the oddity of their appearance within it. "Stop," Lionel said coolly, speaking their language as though he had always been able to do this. It was only when Lionel said this that the old man paused. But, even then, the latter didn't raise his head, not daring to look up for fear of what might happen next. "What is your name?" Lionel asked. "My name is Farley, nobleman." Lionel narrowed his eyes. He just wanted to test the bottom line of these people and also ensure that he had grasped their language as well as he thought he had. "Where is this place, Farley?" "I've lost my way." "Where is the fastest route back?" Lionel wasn't specific with his words on purpose. Any ignorance on his part, if shown in too great a quantity, might result in this situation going south. Before then, Lionel had to make sure he secured as much information as possible. It made sense for a so-called nobleman like him to not know this place. It was a small village, nearby a stream of water, in the middle of a forest. It was doubtful that a person of high standing would know this place like the back of their hand. "Sir, Slail City is 2 days' journey southeast of here. Trith City is a day and a half's journey northwest of here. And Sing City is 3 days' journey west of here." Farley did his best to recall everything and gave all the information he knew of, not holding back. Since Lionel wasn't specific, he just told him everything, hoping one of these cities was Lionel's own. He couldn't help but hold his breath when he saw Lionel's lack of a response. Inwardly, Lionel was frowning. This wasn't because of the information, he had no reason not to trust it. Rather, it was that this little village seemed too weird. Southeast, northwest, and even west itself. This village was entirely surrounded by cities, so why did these people choose to stay here? It was a bit odd. It wasn't like traveling was the issue, these weren't particularly long journeys in the grand scheme of things. Also, danger shouldn't have been a problem either. After following the hunter squad around, it was easy for Lionel to make these sort of deductions. The population of beasts wasn't ridiculously high. In fact, their village didn't even have heavy defenses, there wasn't even a wall around them. So it was relatively safe, the distance wasn't too far, there were several cities to choose from, and yet they all chose to remain here? It wasn't that Lionel didn't believe that some would prefer to live in a more rural area, but when he thought about the split sort of reaction he received, one seething with hatred and the other worshipful as though he was a deity descended from the skies, his brows couldn't help but furrow. Lionel shook his head. "Give me some spices and I'll be on my way." Farley kowtowed again and did as Lionel asked, almost handing over way too much. After casually helping the burly man heal, Lionel turned toward the direction of Trith City, the closest of the three, and vanished. Chapter 1504. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1504. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel grilled meat in one hand and seasoned it with the other. His Radiant Force and Scarlet Star Force might have been powerful fire forces, but they were no good at cooking. One was radioactive and the other was intent on destroying everything in its path. So, for something like this, Lionel could only use regular fire force. But, it was more difficult than he thought it would be. Lionel had never really struggled with pulling atmospheric force toward himself until he stepped foot into the Void Palace. By then, the anarchic force was so dense that using atmospheric force was mostly a pipe dream. This was a large part of why Lionel had still rarely used his Scarlet Star Force even after awakening the ability to pull it toward him on a whim. Lionel had thought that he wouldn't need to worry about it anymore while he was in this place since there was no anarchic force. But, just like with all the other oddities, he still struggled. Back when he was practically dying of thirst, he had to approach a river to find dense enough water force to satiate himself. Usually, he would be able to call upon water force whenever he wanted now, thanks to his divine armor. But if he did that here, he would be lucky to form a single drop. ND, a no VE1. This matter stretched to other things as well. For example, Lionel concluded that the reason his arrows hadn't been devastating was that he had shot from too far away. Previously, shooting from 500 meters away, so long as anarchic force wasn't present, was as easy as breathing. But, in this place, his bow force actually weakened so much over this distance. Now, his previous 500-meter range was about equivalent to his current 100 to 75-meter range. He would definitely have to adjust. Unfortunately, the problems just kept coming. After a day and a half, Lionel had still not spotted the city. His first thought was that the old man had lied to him, but Lionel frowned at such a possibility. He was very good at reading people. Even though he couldn't be considered to be a lie detector, he still didn't believe that Farley would have even dared to lie to him in the first place. Is it possible? A thought flashed in Lionel's eyes. He didn't consider for a moment that he had deviated from the right path. His sense of direction was too solid. He did consider the possibility that the old man's sense of direction wouldn't be as strong as his own. Plus, if the city was just a little bit off the cardinal direction the old man had stated, Lionel could end up way off. Still, Lionel thought that it was likely the hidden third open. And, over 3 more days after the initial day and a half estimate, he finally saw it looming ahead. As expected, the estimates for speed the old man had given were based on what he thought of Lionel, a realization that made the latter especially serious. Obviously, Lionel hadn't gone all out during the past several days and even took a lot of time to check around for clues and signs of human life, just in case he had veered off course. However, for Farley to underestimate his speed by 3 times, just how strong were these noblemen? And what would Lionel do now that he was here? Up ahead, an enormous city loomed. It was like a steel behemoth, its walls flashing with silvery lights and only the tallest buildings within being barely visible from Lionel's vantage point. However, very quickly, Lionel realized that the city was much further away than he thought it was. It was just that the city was so large that it had taken a moment for his perception to adjust. When he calculated how large it must be, his brows couldn't help but shoot up. Lionel entered stealth mode, becoming even more focused than he had been before. If Farley could see through him before, it was clear that his previous attempts hadn't been nearly good enough. Of course, Lionel had gotten complacent after 3 days as well, not to mention the fact that he had been hungry. But now, he was in top shape. Lionel didn't understand enough about this situation to enter the city so freely. He had to observe a bit first. As Lionel got closer, he realized he was still several dozen kilometers away. This wouldn't normally be an issue with his speed, but the main problem was that the number of beasts seemed to increase rather than lessen. At the same time, the force in the air seemed to also thicken. When Lionel finally managed to enter a kilometer range, his eyes couldn't help but widen. The entire city, no, it was only accurate to say that the portions of the city that Lionel could see were surrounded by an abyss. Chains connected the open city gates. Just from Lionel's point of view, there were 3. Each chain link was tens of meters across and their thickness didn't need to be mentioned. Those that wanted to enter the city crossed these paths, risking what seemed like life and limb just for a chance. And, from what it seemed, there were even some that were turned away at the entrance and forced to go back. Lionel watched as several fell to their deaths. Some had even been close but were assaulted by an unlucky rush of powerful wind. What kind of city is this? Lionel was at a loss. Was it worth risking life and death to enter? There were some that didn't seem to need to risk as much to enter. These individuals procured the help of large snake beasts that coiled their bodies around the chains to slither forward, swaying along with the chains. From what Lionel had seen, not a single ground escorted by one of these snakes had died. However, it seemed to be very expensive to gain such a service. In addition, it was mostly a route taken by individuals who seemed to be merchants. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they gained a large discount for their efforts. Just as Lionel was thinking about whether or not the risk would be worth it, he froze. Right then, a merchant carriage rolled to the edge of the abyss. Unlike the other carriages, this one pulled along a cage on wheels. What made Lionel freeze was that within these cages, beaten and ragged, were Noah and Miguel. Lionel's gaze flickered with rage. Chapter 1505. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1505. Who could? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This scene confirmed to Lionel that he definitely wasn't in the spear domain zone. However, aside from that small bit of assurance, there was nothing else to be happy about. He couldn't say that he cared very much for Miguel, but he didn't hate him either. The two just had their own separate perspectives on certain matters. Lionel wouldn't just watch as Miguel was taken into what clearly seemed to be slavery without doing anything. And, even if Lionel had no intention of saving Miguel and he turned a blind eye to it all, he couldn't possibly leave his cousin alone like this, right? Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. P1E's visit N0VE1B, in. His gaze shifted toward the bridge and then the city. What little information he had told him that his best chance at saving these two was to act right this moment. With such a large city, with such a menacing atmosphere, Lionel was certain that whoever was in charge was a monster in their own right. Lionel hadn't even been confident in taking down the warrior of a little village without using some tricks. And, if not for his sharp senses and quick reaction time, he would have lost his life to the old man. Yet, it was all too obvious to him that they feared these so-called noblemen, down to the deepest depths of their bones. Even without seeing the strongest of this world, Lionel knew from this alone that they weren't to be trifled with. And, since these slave traffickers were acting in broad daylight, it was clearly within the rules of the city for them to act as such. This meant that Lionel wouldn't have morality on his side either. Plus, even if Lionel didn't have any of these reference points, just the fact that whoever had targeted the Void Palace dared to swallow up their seventh-dimensional powerhouses into this place as well meant that, in all likelihood, there were individuals here more than capable of dealing with such existences. There was always a possibility that this wasn't the case, but if the seventh-dimensional existences of the Void Palace could truly move freely, they would have long since made a huge commotion to gather up all the students to think of a plan. The fact they hadn't spoke volumes. Lionel's jaw clenched, his gaze flickering back and forth between several crucial points. I'm 100% confident in crossing the chain bridge, but fighting on it would be impossible. There's a 50-50 shot that I fall if I start a battle there, so it'll have to be before they begin crossing. But, if I attack before then? No, this is really the only choice. Lionel took a breath, his gaze turning frighteningly cold. His mind was only filled with one thought. If Noah and Miguel could be taken in like this, what about everyone else? How many had been taken into slavery like this? And what about Aina? Just die. Lionel was decisive. The moment he made his choice, he rose to his feet high in the trees and fired. Before anyone could realize what was happening, 3 heads were skewered through. Lionel had learned his lesson from the last time. 500 meters was much too far away, but this time, he was only 100 meters away. At this distance, his lethality was on a whole other level. Clang! Lionel's gaze flickered when his arrow failed to shatter the lock of the cage, but his hands didn't falter. He had already accounted for such a possibility. He didn't believe that his cousin or Miguel had been stagnant during the year it had been since he saw them. The fact they were captured spoke not only to the strength of their captors, but also their means. In the brief instant of Lionel's failed assault, the attention of several turned toward his location. If there was one weakness of being a sniper, it was that every shot would expose more information about your whereabouts. In this environment, Lionel couldn't curve his shots very much without using 6-dimensional force. So, after 4, many had already triangulated his position. A powerful aura came crashing down on Lionel from above, but the latter's sharp gaze didn't waver. He knew where these powerful auras were coming from. One was from the man he assumed was an overseer of the city. He was the one who had spoken with the carriage leader and brokered a deal between them and the city. The second was the carriage leader himself. The former wore what looked like a military uniform made of soft fabrics and covered in pockets and simple lines. But the latter was dressed like a wealthy businessman. If not for Lionel's sharp eyes, he would have never known that he was a powerful existence, to begin with. It was clear in an instant, the pressure these two gave off made the burly man of the village look like a joke. However, the fury in Lionel's eyes only grew. He could see it in their eyes. They were actually angry with him for trying to free slaves. He would have respected them more if they took this matter in stride, accepting that this was a normal part of the business they partook in. But, from their gazes, it was clear that they felt like they had an ingrained right to do as they pleased. Such people, quite frankly, disgusted Lionel. At that moment, the seal in Lionel's left kidney shattered, breaking through several layers all at once. From the size of half a fingernail, it grew to about half the size of a large grape, flooding Lionel's body with scarlet star force and turning his pale violet eyes into a liquid red gold. The fifth arrow was already prepared as Lionel's eyes flickered with dancing destruction runes, each more elaborate than the last. Since he had trouble pulling from the atmosphere in this place, he would just pull from his own innate node. Who could stop him? Lionel's fingers released his bowstring, a streak of crimson cutting through the air in its wake. Chapter 1506. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 1506. Shocking ability. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The eyes of the businessman and overseer widened, a spike of danger twisting into their hearts as they felt their lives flash before their eyes. They thought that they had already understood the strength of the attacker, but for this mysterious person's strength to suddenly skyrocket to this level, bang! The lock of the cage shattered. Flames raced across the bars like a disease or a curse, flashing with complex runes as they ruined the structural integrity of the metal. In one moment, the cage felt like it was impregnable. In the next, it crumbled to ash, whistling in the wind as though it was nothing more than the fluttering leaves of a dying tree. When the businessman and overseer realized that they weren't the target of the arrow, they inwardly breathed a sigh of relief, but their expressions became ugly not long later. However, in response, Lionel shot 3 more arrows, each twisting toward a vital point of their bodies. While none of these arrows were powerful by Scarlet Star Force, the application of forceful to their bodies made them carry the strength of a shotgun. The wind clapped like thunder under the speeding arrows, the release of Lionel's bowstring sounding no different from an iron ball tearing a path out of a cannon. Miguel's expression flickered. How could he not be familiar with Scarlet Star Force? With the rarity of the Force, and the fact the person wielding it was trying to save them, he would be a fool to not think of Lionel. Truthfully, Miguel had a lot of reasons to hate Lionel. After all, because of Lionel, his years of effort and accumulated strength at the quasi-sixth dimension was all ruined. Without Lionel's innate node, he had to find a completely different path to enter the sixth-dimensional God path, and as such, he was actually growing weaker by the day instead of stronger. However, Miguel never really took this personally, he just took it as him being unlucky. Whether he won the fight against Lionel or not, he would have still given Lionel his innate node back. The main reason he hadn't earlier was that it would have left him too injured to fight in the first place. Seeing Lionel now, though, left him with a whole host of complicated feelings. Still, these complicated feelings didn't slow his movements in the slightest. Miguel and Noah sprung action at once. Though their hands and feet were both bound, the two were experts in their own right. The chains that bound their ankles were 2 feet apart and were linked to the chains that bound their wrists. Still, they were able to begin running with a crouch and short steps. The two of them weren't the only ones in the carriage. In fact, there were others of the Void Palace inside as well. However, it was only the two of them who recognized Lionel without laying eyes on him and as such shot in his direction without hesitation. Seeing their reaction, many subconsciously followed while others broke off in different directions, hoping to take advantage of the situation. With most focused on a single path, there might be less people who chased after them. Lionel continued to cover their retreat, his arrows peppering the guards, businessmen and overseer to the point they couldn't even begin to run after the escapees. Each one of Lionel's arrows was menacing and placed in an awkward position. He aimed for their eyes, their knees, their feet, even their crotches. He held nothing back, assaulting them with numbers. Fuck. He can't use it anymore, charge forward. The overseer's skin suddenly flashed with a metallic light. His hands snapped outward as though he was throwing daggers, but he had nothing in his palms at all. To Lionel's shock, though, layers of the overseer's skin peeled off, attaching to the thick trees in the surroundings. Soon, the overseer shot forward, bouncing between the trees at a speed that was almost impossible to track. Between bounces, he would throw out more silver discs, attaching them to more and more trees. He flew forward like a speeding bullet, his body becoming a large streak of silver. It took no more than a single breath for him to cut the distance between himself and the nearest escapee to less than 5 meters. Lionel was stunned by what he was seeing. He could tag this ability to a specific ability index, and it even seemed like a combination of many of them, including Alan's magnet ability index. However, that was all. The overseer might be far faster than Lionel now, but his movement had also become far more predictable. Facing an enemy like Lionel, he had basically just sealed his fate. Lionel didn't even take a breath of time to calculate, his fingers having already released. The overseer suddenly panicked. He released that with the way Lionel's arrow had curved, he was adding to its force with his own momentum. Even if Lionel didn't use Scarlet Star Force again. Thwack! The overseer was pierced through the forehead, the head of Lionel's arrow tearing into his skull just as the body of the arrow exploded into countless pieces. With a heavy thump, the overseer crashed into the tree he was magnetically attached to. There was such speed and force behind it that the tree cracked, beginning to slowly fall forward. Lionel frowned slightly. This was a bit of a problem. He took a breath, 6-dimensional force spinning around his arrow as he released it. It tore through skies so quickly that there was absolute silence even after it crashed into its target. P1E's visit N0VE1B, in. T-bang. The arrow curled around, smashing into the side of the tree. An explosion sounded, a huge chunk of the bark and trunk imploded until it looked as though a giant had taken a giant bite out of it. The falling tree deviated, stopping its forward momentum and beginning to fall back and to the side. The pursuing guards, businessmen and lagging overseers suddenly found the behemoth-like shadow of a tree quickly falling toward them, their faces contorting in shock. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.